Kim Il-sung, the Eternal Leader and the Making of North Korea's Dynasty, Part 1, Early Life of Kim Il-sung, Roots, Birth, and Family Background. The man who would one day dominate the political and historical narrative of North Korea as Kim Il-sung was born on the 15th of April, 1912, under the name Kim Song-ju. This birth occurred at a turning point in global history, as the era of empires began to fade into an age of modern nation-states. Kim's birthplace was the modest and unassuming village of Namni, a small, quiet settlement that would, in future decades, become absorbed into the city of Pyongyang, now the capital of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. At the time of Kim's birth, however, the Korean peninsula was a land very different from its modern self. It existed under the colonial rule of Japan, which referred to Korea as Chin, the name given to this territory following its annexation into the Japanese Empire. To understand the significance of Kim Il-sung's upbringing and eventual role in history, it is essential to trace his lineage and the societal currents that shaped his formative years. Central to this storied genealogy was Kim Tae-seo, a notable figure believed to be a descendant of King Gyeong, son of Silla. King Gyeong's son was the final ruler of the Silla dynasty, which had dominated the Korean peninsula during the 7th to 10th centuries. However, despite these illustrious connections to Korea's royal past, the family's fortunes had greatly diminished by the late 19th century, their prestige a mere echo of ancient glory. Kim Il-sung's immediate family embodied a complex blend of Korean tradition and new influences brought about by globalization and colonialism. During the mid-19th century, Korea remained a relatively closed society, holding to its Joseon dynasty traditions. However, as foreign missionaries and merchants began arriving on the Korean peninsula, they brought with them ideas and ideologies that would have profound effects on individuals like Kim Hyong-jik. One of the most prominent groups among these foreigners were Western Christian missionaries, particularly from Protestant denominations. From the 1860s onward, Presbyterian missionaries, primarily Scottish Calvinists, began to establish churches and schools throughout Korea. He converted to Presbyterian Christianity, a decision that marked the family as part of a broader trend among Koreans who sought both spiritual solace and educational opportunities in a rapidly changing and oppressed society. As a result, the Kim family became part of a small yet influential group of Koreans whose lives were shaped by both Confucian traditions and Protestant ethics. This duality, a connection to Korea's ancient heritage and exposure to modern ideas through religion, would deeply influence Kim Song-jae's upbringing. Kim Hyong-jik was not the only significant figure in the young Kim's life. His mother, Kang Pan-suk, also played an instrumental role in shaping his early years. A woman of resilience and strength, Kang Pan-suk supported her husband through their family's struggles, raising their children in an environment where education, faith, and opposition to oppression were central values. The couple would have several children, but their firstborn son, Kim Song-ju, would later eclipse his siblings in historical importance. Two of his younger brothers, Kim Yong-ju and Kim Chul-ju, would go on to play varying roles in Korea's turbulent history, though under far less dramatic circumstances than their elder sibling. Kim Yong-ju, remarkably, lived into the 21st century, passing away in 2021 after having once been considered a potential political successor to Kim Il-sung during the late 1970s. In contrast, Kim Chul-jae's life came to a tragic and untimely end during the Korean resistance against Japanese colonial rule, a harsh and unforgiving struggle that shaped Kim Song-jae's outlook as a young man. The historical context of Kim's birth, a nation in crisis, to fully appreciate the environment into which Kim Song-ju was born, one must consider the broader historical and political context of Korea in the early 20th century. For centuries, the Joseon Kingdom of Korea had been a fiercely independent, Confucian society. Its rulers had chosen to adopt an isolationist stance during the 17th century, largely closing the kingdom's borders to foreign trade and influence. The first encounters with Europeans, particularly the Dutch and Portuguese, had been viewed with suspicion, and Korea sought to maintain its sovereignty by insulating itself from external pressures. This policy of seclusion, however, was destined to crumble by the mid-19th century. The 19th century was an era of imperialism and rapid industrialization, during which technologically advanced powers such as Britain, France, and the United States forced their way into Asian markets. These Western nations, eager to expand their trade networks and assert their dominance, pressured China, Japan, and Korea to open their borders to foreign commerce and ideas. In Japan, this external pressure culminated in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The Japanese leaders of the Meiji era recognized that embracing Western industrial techniques, military strategies, and governance systems was essential to maintaining their sovereignty and becoming a major power in the Western Pacific. Japan's transformation into an imperialist force was swift and startling. By the 1870s, it had begun to assert its dominance over neighboring Korea. The unequal Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876 was a decisive moment. Korea was coerced into opening its ports to Japanese merchants, thus initiating decades of increasing Japanese control over the peninsula. Over the following decades, Japan's victories in wars against China, 1894 to 1895, and Russia, 1904 to 1905, further solidified its position as the preeminent power in East Asia. Finally, in 1910, Japan formalized its control over Korea through annexation, marking the peninsula as the first significant addition to the Empire of Japan. The annexation brought profound changes to Korean society. The Japanese colonial authorities pursued an aggressive policy of assimilation known as Japanification. Korean culture, language, and traditions were systematically suppressed as the Japanese sought to integrate Korea into their empire as a subordinate territory. Schools taught Japanese history and culture, and speaking the Korean language in public became discouraged or outright forbidden. Meanwhile, Korean landowners saw their property seized, and farmers were subjected to heavy taxes that plunged many into poverty. Part 2. Early childhood and the political awakening of young Kim Song-ju. Kim Song-ju, later to be immortalized as Kim Il-sung, spent his earliest years in a Korea burdened by colonial rule. Born in 1912, just 2 years after Korea's formal annexation by Japan, his childhood was shaped by the deep national trauma felt throughout the peninsula. For centuries, the Korean people had maintained a fiercely independent cultural identity, rooted in Confucian values, strong family ties, and respect for ancestral heritage. However, Japan's oppressive rule brought systematic efforts to strip away this identity. Under these circumstances, young Kim's worldview was forged amidst poverty, repression, and a simmering spirit of resistance. The Kim family, though of distinguished ancestry, struggled economically during Kim Song-jae's early childhood. Like many other Korean families, their fortunes had been decimated under Japanese policies that heavily taxed landowners, reallocated property to Japanese settlers, and restricted economic opportunities for native Koreans. Despite their poverty, education remained a core value within the Kim household. As devout Presbyterians, Kim's parents took advantage of opportunities presented by Christian missionary schools. These schools, often established by Western Protestant missions, served as rare avenues for upward mobility in a society where Koreans were otherwise marginalized. For Kim Song-ju, the teachings in these Christian schools planted seeds of both intellectual curiosity and political awareness. Though the faith and morals imparted in these institutions were rooted in Western Christianity, the underlying message of justice, equality, and resistance to tyranny resonated deeply with a young boy living under colonial oppression. Simultaneously, these schools emphasized literacy and modern education, equipping students with skills that would later be vital for participation in emerging political movements. The March 1 movement of 1919, a turning point in Kim's early life. One event that left an indelible mark on Kim Song-jae's early consciousness was the March 1 movement of 1919. By this time, Kim was just 7 years old, but the events of that year cast a long shadow over his formative years. The March 1st movement was born out of decades of growing resentment among Koreans toward Japanese rule. The colonial government had imposed harsh measures to assimilate Korea into the Japanese Empire, including banning the Korean language from schools, forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese names, and encouraging Japanese settlers to dominate Korean society economically. The immediate catalyst for the March 1st movement was the death of Emperor Jong, the last true ruler of Korea before Japanese annexation. Jong had been forced to abdicate in 1907 under Japanese pressure, and his death in January 1919 was widely believed to have been orchestrated, perhaps through poisoning, by Japanese agents. For many Koreans, the emperor's death was the final indignity, a stark reminder of their subjugation. On March 1, 1919, a group of Korean students and intellectuals gathered in Seoul to read the Declaration of Independence, a document that proclaimed Korea's right to self-determination and called for peaceful resistance against Japanese colonial rule. Inspired by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's post-World War I ideals of national self-determination, the movement spread rapidly across the country. Thousands of Koreans, young and old, men and women, took to the streets in protest. The March 1st demonstrations were a moment of extraordinary courage, as Koreans risked their lives to defy a powerful imperial oppressor. However, the Japanese authorities responded with brutal force. Protesters were met with bayonets, rifles, and imprisonment. Estimates suggest that thousands were killed or wounded, and many more were arrested. Entire villages were razed as the Japanese sought to suppress the burgeoning spirit of Korean nationalism. For the Kim family and many others, the March 1st movement was not just a political event but a deeply personal one. Though Kim Song-ju was too young to actively participate, he would have heard the whispers of rebellion and the cries of the wounded echoing through his village. His parents, staunch opponents of Japanese rule, shared the outrage and determination of the Korean people. These events were undoubtedly discussed at the family table, reinforcing Kim's awareness of the injustices suffered by his countrymen. It was within this climate of discontent and resistance that Kim's early ideas about independence, leadership, and revolution began to take root. The legacy of resistance, the Kim family's relocation to Manchuria. By the early 1920s, the Japanese crackdown on Korean descent had grown even harsher. The memory of the March 1st movement lingered as a symbol of hope for some, but it also led to widespread arrests, surveillance, and suppression. The Kim family, already outspoken in their opposition to Japanese rule, found themselves under increasing scrutiny. As a result, many Koreans, including the Kims, were forced to make a difficult choice: remain in their homeland under the yoke of oppression, or leave everything behind and seek refuge elsewhere. In 1920, when Kim Song-ju was just 8 years old, the Kim family made a pivotal decision that would forever alter their lives. They joined a growing exodus of Koreans fleeing the peninsula for the nearby Manchuria region in northeastern China. At the time, Manchuria was a vast, sparsely populated frontier that offered a degree of freedom and opportunity unavailable under Japanese rule. For political exiles, it also served as a haven where resistance movements could take root and grow. The journey to Manchuria was not an easy one. It required traversing difficult terrain, leaving behind family ties and possessions, and adjusting to life in a foreign land. However, for families like the Kims, the move represented both a practical necessity and an act of defiance. Manchuria was a place where they could escape immediate Japanese control and begin building connections with other Korean exiles who shared their nationalist aspirations. Life in Manchuria, a breeding ground for revolution. In Manchuria, the young Kim Song-ju encountered a world that was vibrant with revolutionary fervor. The region had become a melting pot of exiled Koreans, Chinese resistance fighters, and communist agitators. It was a place where ideas about liberation, equality, and armed struggle were debated fiercely. For Kim, this environment would serve as his first true political classroom. Though still a boy, he witnessed firsthand the sacrifices and struggles of those who were committed to freeing Korea from its colonial masters. During this period, Kim's father, Kim Hyong-jik, continued to instill in him a deep sense of patriotism and a commitment to justice. While the elder Kim was not a militant, his religious and moral convictions made him a staunch opponent of Japanese rule. He became involved in underground networks of resistance, often meeting with like-minded Koreans to discuss strategies for opposing their oppressors. Young Kim Song-ju absorbed these lessons, developing a sense of purpose and leadership that would later define his rise to prominence. Part 3: The Down with Imperialism Union and Kim's Early Political Activities. The early 1920s were a formative period for Kim Song-ju, who would later emerge as Kim Il-sung, the future leader of North Korea. Following the Kim family's relocation to Manchuria, the region became both a refuge and a crucible of revolutionary thought. Here, amidst the growing struggles of Koreans in exile, Kim's awareness of colonial oppression, national identity, and the necessity for resistance matured rapidly. Manchuria in the 1920s was far from a peaceful refuge. Though it offered temporary reprieve from direct Japanese control, the region was embroiled in conflicts and economic challenges. It was home to a diverse mix of Chinese warlords, ethnic Korean settlers, Japanese agents, and burgeoning communist groups. For displaced Koreans, life in Manchuria was filled with hardship. Many worked as laborers or farmers under difficult conditions, suffering discrimination and economic exploitation. Nevertheless, it was also a place where nationalist sentiments thrived, and the seeds of armed resistance were being sown. For Kim Song-ju, this environment provided opportunities to engage with political movements far earlier than most of his peers. While the details of Kim's early years in Manchuria are clouded by myth, much of it perpetuated later by North Korean propaganda, several significant events shaped his emerging identity as a revolutionary. The Down with Imperialism Union, Myth and Reality. In 1926, at the age of just 14, Kim Song-ju was said to have founded a revolutionary group known as the Down with Imperialism Union. This narrative, propagated by North Korean state media and detailed in Kim Il-sung's memoirs, With the Century, paints him as a precocious and visionary leader who took a stand against Japanese imperialism from a remarkably young age. The Union, according to these accounts, aimed to liberate Korea from colonial rule and overthrow imperialist forces worldwide. However, objective historical accounts provide a more tempered view. Scholars and historians have cast doubt on the extent of Kim's involvement in founding the Down with Imperialism Union. At just 14 years old, it seems unlikely that Kim possessed the organizational capacity or resources to establish such a group independently. Instead, the creation of the Union is often attributed to R.I. Chongrag, a prominent Korean radical in Manchuria at the time. R.I. and others were actively working to unite exiled Koreans in the region under various anti-Japanese and pro-independence banners. While the Union may not have been entirely Kim's brainchild, his association with the group marks the beginning of his active engagement with political resistance. It is clear that by the mid-1920s, Kim was already deeply involved in revolutionary circles, attending meetings, listening to fiery speeches, and absorbing the ideologies of resistance leaders. The Down with Imperialism Union, whether real or exaggerated in later retellings, symbolized the merging of Kim's personal ambition with the broader nationalist cause that resonated deeply with Koreans across Manchuria. Political education. Kim's years at Yuan Middle School. During the late 1920s, Kim Song-ju attended Yuan Middle School in Jilin Province, located in northeastern China. This period proved to be a critical phase in his political and ideological development. Yuan Middle School was not merely an academic institution, it was a hotbed of political activity. Many of its students and teachers were active in underground resistance groups, including early communist cells, which sought to challenge Japanese imperialism and support the plight of oppressed peoples. At Yuan, Kim was introduced to Marxism-Leninism, the ideology that would come to define much of his life. He began to study the works of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin, gaining an understanding of proletarian revolution and class struggle. For a young Korean living in exile, Marxist ideas offered not only a theoretical framework but also a practical strategy for liberation. Communism, with its emphasis on equality, anti-imperialism, and collective action, seemed to align perfectly with the goals of Korean nationalists fighting Japanese oppression. Kim also witnessed firsthand the profound divisions within Chinese society at the time. China in the 1920s was racked by civil war and political turmoil. The two dominant factions, the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) and the Kuomintang (KMT), or Chinese nationalists, were locked in a bitter struggle for control of the country. While both groups opposed Japanese expansion in China and Manchuria, their methods and ideologies differed greatly. The CCP, in particular, appealed to Kim because of its emphasis on revolutionary struggle and proletarian solidarity. These experiences helped Kim forge connections with Chinese communists and solidify his belief that armed resistance would be the key to freeing Korea. Kim's arrest and early struggles, Kim Song-jae's increasing political involvement did not go unnoticed. By 1929, when he was just 17 years old, Kim was arrested by the Chinese authorities for his involvement in communist activities. This arrest was not an isolated incident but part of a broader crackdown on Korean and Chinese radicals who were seen as a threat to the established order. The experience of imprisonment was harsh and humiliating, but it also served as a rite of passage for the young revolutionary. While imprisoned, Kim had time to reflect on his role in the struggle against Japanese imperialism. Far from breaking his resolve, the experience deepened his commitment to the cause. Upon his release, Kim's reputation among his peers grew. He was now seen as someone who had suffered for the movement, a badge of honor in the eyes of fellow revolutionaries. Emergence as a young leader, by the early 1930s, Kim Song-ju had begun to emerge as a prominent figure within the Korean resistance movement in Manchuria. His youthful energy, charisma, and ability to inspire others set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He delivered passionate speeches about the need for unity among Koreans and the importance of armed struggle against Japan. These speeches resonated with the thousands of exiled Koreans who had suffered under colonial rule and were searching for a leader who could articulate their hopes and frustrations. At the same time, Kim's association with Chinese communists provided him with valuable military training and organizational experience. He learned the tactics of guerrilla warfare, which would later become his hallmark strategy during the Korean resistance. These early lessons in leadership, ideology, and military strategy laid the groundwork for Kim's rise to prominence as a revolutionary commander. Part 4: The Japanese Invasion of Manchuria and Kim's Rise as a Guerrilla Leader. The early 1930s marked a turning point not just in Kim Song-jae's life but in the geopolitical landscape of East Asia. On September 18, 1931, the Japanese Imperial Army launched what became known as the Mukden Incident, a staged event near the city of Shenyang, then called Mukden, in Manchuria. The Japanese used this minor railway explosion as a pretext to invade and occupy the region, a calculated move to expand their control in northern China. Within months, the Japanese established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, as its nominal head. Behind the facade, however, Manchukuo was governed as an extension of the Japanese Empire, with its resources and people exploited for imperial ambitions. This invasion and occupation had profound consequences for Koreans living in Manchuria. Already displaced from their homeland, many Koreans now found themselves under Japanese oppression once more. This situation radicalized thousands of exiles, who turned to underground resistance movements. For Kim Song-ju, who had spent his youth steeped in anti-imperialist ideology, the Japanese invasion became a catalyst for action. No longer content with speeches and small political gatherings, Kim began his transformation into a guerrilla leader, a figure who would take the fight to the Japanese through direct military confrontation. Kim's early role in the anti-Japanese resistance. By 1932, Kim had joined the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army, a coalition of Korean and Chinese communists who sought to resist Japanese occupation through guerrilla warfare. This movement drew support from peasants, workers, and exiled intellectuals who viewed armed resistance as the only viable path to liberation. At just 20 years of age, Kim's reputation as a capable and charismatic organizer began to grow within this movement. The nature of guerrilla warfare in Manchuria was harsh and unforgiving. The terrain, rugged mountains, dense forests, and freezing winters, posed immense challenges for resistance fighters. Supplies were scarce, morale was difficult to sustain, and Japanese forces were relentless in their pursuit of insurgents. The Japanese military conducted brutal scorched earth campaigns, burning villages, executing suspected collaborators, and imprisoning thousands in concentration camps to root out resistance networks. Despite these hardships, the anti-Japanese fighters, including Kim and his comrades, adapted to their environment, employing hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and sabotage to harass Japanese forces and disrupt their operations. During this period, Kim began to distinguish himself as a natural leader. While some resistance leaders operated in isolation or relied heavily on Chinese support, Kim emphasized building strong ties with local Korean communities. He visited villages, spoke to farmers and laborers, and inspired them to join the cause or provide vital supplies and intelligence. His ability to connect with ordinary people, combined with his growing military skills, earned him both respect and followers. It was during these years that Kim first began to cultivate the image of a heroic leader, a portrayal that North Korean propaganda would later elevate to near-mythic proportions. The Manchuria incident and the purges of Koreans in Manchuria. Kim's rise as a prominent resistance leader was not without significant challenges. By the mid-1930s, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, which had been Kim's primary ally, became increasingly suspicious of its Korean comrades. These suspicions were rooted in fears that Korean militants operating in Manchuria might be infiltrated by Japanese spies or saboteurs. This period of paranoia culminated in the Manchuria incident, a series of purges conducted between 1933 and 1936, during which many Korean communists were arrested, tortured, and executed under false accusations of collaborating with the Japanese. The Manchuria incident was devastating for the Korean resistance movement. Hundreds of its most experienced leaders were killed, and trust between the CCP and the Koreans was severely eroded. Kim Song-ju, however, managed to survive the purges. Rather than retreating into obscurity, he used this period to further consolidate his leadership among the remaining Korean militants. Archival records suggest that Kim defended his fellow Koreans within the Chinese Communist Party, arguing passionately against the blanket accusations of disloyalty. His ability to navigate this treacherous political landscape and emerge unscathed further cemented his reputation as a leader who could survive against all odds. The emergence of Kim Il-sung, adopting that son of resistance. It was around this time, in 1935, that Kim Song-ju began using the name by which he would be remembered, Kim Il-sung. The name, which translates roughly as Kim become the sun, carried profound symbolic weight. In Korean culture, the sun represents life, light, and leadership, qualities that Kim sought to embody as he rose to prominence in the resistance. The name also marked a deliberate step in shaping his public persona, as he began to position himself not merely as a soldier but as the symbolic leader of the Korean liberation movement. The adoption of this name foreshadowed Kim's growing ambition and his understanding of the power of symbolism in uniting a fragmented resistance under a common cause. Over time, the name Kim Il-sung would come to represent more than just an individual. It would embody the struggle of the Korean people against imperial domination, a narrative that Kim and his successors would amplify in later decades. The Battle of Pochombo, a turning point. By the mid-1930s, Kim Il-sung's reputation as a guerrilla leader had begun to extend beyond Manchuria and into Korea itself. His growing band of fighters, operating alongside Chinese communists, launched small-scale raids on Japanese outposts, transportation lines, and supply depots. These raids, though limited in scope, served a dual purpose. They disrupted Japanese operations and inspired hope among ordinary Koreans, who saw in Kim's efforts a glimpse of resistance against overwhelming odds. A pivotal moment in Kim's rise occurred in 1937 at the Battle of Pochonbo, a raid that would later be mythologized in North Korean history. Kim, leading a detachment of approximately 200 guerrilla fighters, crossed the border into northern Korea and attacked the Japanese-held town of Pochonbo. The raid was meticulously planned and executed. Kim's forces overwhelmed the Japanese garrison, destroyed police stations and administrative buildings, and temporarily seized control of the town. Though the Battle of Pochonbo was small in scale, lasting only a few hours, it had enormous symbolic significance. News of the raid spread quickly, and for the first time in years, Koreans living under Japanese rule saw evidence that armed resistance was not only possible but could also be effective. The attack turned Kim Il-sung into a folk hero among Korean nationalists, and his reputation as both a military tactician and a leader of the resistance grew exponentially. Conclusion: Kim Il-sung's transformation into a resistance icon. The late 1930s solidified Kim Il-sung's role as one of the leading figures in the Korean resistance movement. His combination of guerrilla tactics, charismatic leadership, and ability to adapt to shifting political alliances set him apart from many of his contemporaries. At the same time, the Japanese escalation of hostilities in China and the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 created new opportunities for resistance movements across East Asia. While much of Kim's early activities would later be exaggerated or embellished by North Korean propaganda, there is little doubt that he played a significant role in mobilizing Koreans against Japanese imperialism. His experiences during this period, navigating persecution, building alliances, and leading successful raids, shaped the leader he would become. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, Kim Il-sung had laid the foundation for his eventual emergence as the dominant figure in post-war Korean politics. Part 5: World War II, Soviet Influence, and Kim's Rise to Power in North Korea. As the late 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the East Asian geopolitical landscape entered a new and far bloodier chapter. The Japanese invasion of China in 1937 had escalated into a full-scale war, further entrenching Japanese dominance in Manchuria and northern China. Simultaneously, tensions between Japan and the Soviet Union, which bordered northeastern China and Korea, grew to the breaking point. The expanding war effort intensified Japanese militarization and oppression in Korea, but it also presented new opportunities for resistance movements. During this period, Kim Il-sung, already emerging as a key figure in the Korean anti-Japanese resistance, would further solidify his position, aligning himself with broader Soviet strategic interests. While Japanese forces cracked down on resistance across Manchuria and the Korean peninsula, Kim's ability to survive and adapt set him apart. By the end of World War II, Kim would emerge not only as a guerrilla leader but also as the preferred candidate of the Soviet Union to lead the northern half of a newly liberated Korea. Retreat to Soviet territory, the 88th International Brigade, the Japanese military's brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in Manchuria during the late 1930s decimated many Korean and Chinese resistance groups. Kim Il-sung and his comrades, who had waged guerrilla warfare for nearly a decade, were no exception. The Japanese launched sweeping operations to root out insurgents, using a combination of scorched earth tactics, torture, and mass executions. Resistance forces were forced deeper into remote mountainous areas, struggling to survive. Kim and his remaining fighters found themselves increasingly isolated and outnumbered. By 1940, the Japanese military considered Kim Il-sung one of the most wanted men in East Asia. Posters bearing his image circulated throughout the region, and Japanese forces devoted considerable resources to hunting him down. Recognizing the dire situation, Kim and his guerrilla group made a calculated retreat across the border into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had long supported communist revolutionary movements across Asia as a means of countering Japanese imperial ambitions. Kim's relocation to Soviet-controlled territory marked the beginning of a critical new phase in his political and military career. In 1942, Kim and his surviving comrades were incorporated into the Soviet military as part of the 88th International Brigade, a unit composed of Korean and Chinese anti-Japanese fighters. The brigade, stationed in the Soviet Far East near the borders of Manchuria and Korea, served two purposes. It allowed the Soviets to train and organize experienced resistance fighters, and it enabled figures like Kim to forge closer ties with Soviet officials. This period of training in Soviet territory would prove invaluable to Kim, both militarily and politically. Under Soviet guidance, Kim received training in modern warfare tactics, military strategy, and leadership. Soviet officers taught him how to organize troops, plan coordinated attacks, and use advanced weaponry. These skills, coupled with his previous experience in guerrilla warfare, transformed Kim into a formidable military leader. Just as importantly, Kim developed relationships with key Soviet commanders and political figures, relationships that would later play a decisive role in his rise to power. Kim's personal life during the war, marriage and family. Amid the turmoil of war and exile, Kim Il-sung's personal life also entered a new phase. In 1941, he married Kim Jong-suk, a fellow resistance fighter who had been orphaned during the Japanese conquest of Manchuria. Kim Jong-suk was a committed revolutionary in her own right, having joined the anti-Japanese struggle as a teenager in the mid-1930s. According to North Korean state narratives, she once saved Kim's life during an ambush, an event that became part of the carefully constructed mythology surrounding their relationship. Shortly after their marriage, Kim Jong-suk gave birth to the couple's first child, Kim Jong-il, in either 1941 or 1942. The precise details of Kim Jong-il's birth remain shrouded in propaganda and controversy. North Korean accounts claim that he was born on Mount Paektu, a sacred site in Korean mythology, under a double rainbow and amidst the appearance of a bright star in the sky, a narrative intended to underscore his divine and destined leadership. However, other accounts suggest that Kim Jong-il was born in Soviet territory during his parents' time in exile. Regardless of the truth, the mythologizing of Kim's family life began early and would later become a cornerstone of North Korea's cult of personality. The turning tide of World War II. By the early 1940s, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn. Japan, once ascendant across East Asia and the Pacific, now found itself increasingly on the defensive. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war, transforming it into a truly global conflict. American victories in the Pacific, coupled with the Soviet Union's growing strength on the Asian mainland, placed enormous pressure on Japan. Although the Soviet Union maintained a non-aggression pact with Japan for much of the war, Stalin had his own designs for the future of East Asia. In particular, the Soviets sought to expand their influence into Manchuria and Korea, regions that had long been contested by Japan, China, and Russia. As the European theater of World War II drew to a close in mid-1945, Stalin turned his attention eastward. On August 8, 1945, just 2 days after the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan. Within days, the Red Army launched a massive offensive into Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese forces in a lightning-fast campaign. Soviet troops advanced southward toward Korea, quickly securing the northern half of the peninsula. Liberation and division, the birth of a new Korea. The Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, brought an end to their colonial rule over Korea, a moment that Koreans had long awaited. However, this victory did not lead to immediate unity or independence. Instead, Korea was divided into two spheres of influence. the Soviet Union occupied the northern half of the peninsula, while the United States took control of the southern half. The dividing line was established at the 38th parallel, a decision made hastily by Allied leaders without consulting the Korean people. In the Soviet-occupied North, Joseph Stalin and his advisors began searching for a reliable leader to establish a communist regime. Among the candidates was Kim Il-sung, who had spent the past 5 years building connections with Soviet officials while proving himself as a capable military leader. Kim's time in the 88th International Brigade had positioned him as a trusted ally of the Soviet Union, and his Korean heritage made him an ideal figurehead for the new regime. In September 1945, Kim Il-sung returned to Korea for the first time in decades, not as an exile or a guerrilla fighter, but as a Soviet-backed leader. He arrived in Pyongyang to a hero's welcome, orchestrated in part by the Soviet authorities who sought to present him as the natural leader of the Korean people. His speeches emphasized liberation, independence, and the rebuilding of a strong, unified Korea. For many Koreans in the North, Kim represented hope for a brighter future after decades of suffering under Japanese rule. However, the seeds of division had already been sown. While Kim consolidated power in the Soviet-occupied North, American-backed leaders like Syngman Rhee emerged in the South. The ideological split between communism and capitalism, fueled by the broader Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States, would soon tear the peninsula apart. Part 6: The establishment of North Korea and Kim Il-sung's rise to absolute power. As the dust settled on World War II and Japanese colonial rule ended, Korea stood at a historic crossroads. The division of the peninsula along the 38th parallel was initially seen as a temporary arrangement to facilitate the withdrawal of Japanese forces and the stabilization of the region. However, the growing ideological rift between the Soviet Union and the United States, now the two dominant powers in the emerging Cold War, ensured that Korea's division would harden into a long-term geopolitical reality. In the north, where Soviet forces had established control, Kim Il-sung was emerging as the central figure in the political reshaping of Korean society. Backed by the Soviet Union, Kim had the advantage of Soviet military and political support as he consolidated his power, eliminating rivals and laying the foundation for what would become the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. Kim Il-sung's return to Korea and Soviet support. When Kim Il-sung returned to Korea in September 1945, he was relatively unknown to the Korean population at large. Having spent most of his life in Manchuria and the Soviet Union, Kim's name carried little weight compared to other nationalist leaders who had remained in Korea during Japanese rule or led prominent exile movements abroad. Figures such as Jo Man-sik, a Korean nationalist with a strong following in Pyongyang, initially posed a challenge to Kim's leadership ambitions. However, the Soviet authorities viewed Kim as an ideal candidate to establish a communist government in northern Korea. His guerrilla warfare experience, his ties to the Soviet Union through the 88th International Brigade, and his ability to mobilize Korean resistance fighters gave him credibility in the eyes of the Soviets. Kim also possessed the charisma and adaptability necessary to rally popular support, even as he faced internal opposition. Upon his arrival, Soviet authorities organized mass rallies and carefully choreographed events to introduce Kim to the public as a hero of the Korean resistance. At a rally in Pyongyang in October 1945, Kim delivered his first major speech to a crowd eager to hear from their supposed liberator. He spoke of independence, rebuilding Korea, and eliminating imperialist influence, rhetoric that resonated deeply with a population still scarred by decades of colonial oppression. However, behind the scenes, Kim and his Soviet backers were working to ensure that rival factions would not challenge his authority. Key nationalist and communist leaders who were unwilling to align with Kim's Soviet-backed vision were either marginalized or eliminated. The Soviets, through their military and political advisors, provided critical support in these efforts, helping Kim organize a political apparatus that would ultimately cement his position as the undisputed leader of Northern Korea. The formation of the Workers' Party of Korea, in the immediate post-war years, the political landscape of Northern Korea was dominated by competing factions, including Korean nationalists, communists loyal to China, and those aligned with the Soviet Union. To consolidate power, Kim Il-sung worked diligently to merge these factions under a single, unified banner. This effort culminated in the establishment of the Workers' Party of North Korea in 1946, a precursor to the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK. The Workers' Party became the vehicle through which Kim would consolidate his authority. Soviet advisors guided Kim in creating a highly centralized party structure modeled after the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Positions of power were filled with Kim's most loyal supporters, while potential rivals were purged or sidelined. The party began implementing land reforms, industrial nationalization, and other measures aligned with Soviet-style socialism. One of Kim's earliest policies, the Land Reform Program of 1946, was particularly popular among the peasantry. Under Japanese colonial rule, large landowners, many of whom collaborated with the Japanese, had controlled much of Korea's arable land. Kim's government confiscated land from these landowners and redistributed it to peasants, earning him widespread support among the rural population. This reform also served a dual purpose. It weakened the influence of Korea's traditional elite, many of whom opposed Kim's leadership, while solidifying his base of support among the working class. At the same time, Kim oversaw the nationalization of industries that had been previously controlled by Japanese corporations. Factories, mines, and transportation networks were brought under state control, aligning Northern Korea's economy with the broader goals of Soviet socialism. These measures, while disruptive, were portrayed as necessary steps toward building a self-reliant, independent Korean state. The division of Korea, South and North take shape. While Kim Il-sung was consolidating his hold on Northern Korea, the political situation in the South was following a very different trajectory. Under American occupation, efforts to establish a democratic government were marred by political instability, ideological conflicts, and violence. The United States supported conservative nationalist leaders, most notably Syngman Rhee, who was staunchly anti-communist and had spent years in exile in the United States. By 1948, the division of Korea had become irreversible. The United States, frustrated by the failure to negotiate a unified Korean government with the Soviet Union, pushed ahead with elections in the South. These elections, boycotted by Northern Korean leaders and many Southern leftists, resulted in the establishment of the Republic of Korea, ROK, on August 15, 1948, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. In response, Kim Il-sung and his Soviet backers organized their own elections in the North on August 25, 1948. These elections were tightly controlled, and Kim's Workers' Party emerged as the dominant force. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was formally proclaimed, with Kim Il-sung installed as its premier and de facto leader. The creation of the DPRK marked the beginning of Kim's regime and formalized the division of the Korean peninsula into two ideologically opposed states, Communist North Korea and capitalist South Korea. This division, rooted in the geopolitical rivalry of the Cold War, would define Korea's fate for decades to come. Kim Il-sung's early policies, building a totalitarian state, with his authority established, Kim Il-sung moved swiftly to reshape North Korea according to his vision. His regime adopted many features of Soviet-style communism, including centralized economic planning, collectivized agriculture, and state control of industry. Propaganda became a key tool of the state, as Kim began to cultivate a cult of personality around himself. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and posters celebrated Kim as the great leader and the liberator of the Korean people. The years immediately following the creation of the DPRK were marked by efforts to consolidate political control. Kim targeted opponents within the party and broader society, accusing them of counter-revolutionary activities. Rival factions, whether real or perceived, were purged through show trials, imprisonment, and executions. By the early 1950s, Kim had eliminated most of his political rivals and solidified his position as the undisputed leader of North Korea. At the same time, Kim began laying the ideological groundwork for what would become the Juche philosophy, a doctrine of self-reliance that emphasized Korean nationalism and independence from foreign influence. Though Juche would not be fully articulated until the 1950s and 1960s, its roots were visible in Kim's early rhetoric and policies, which stressed national pride and the strength of the Korean people under his leadership. Part 7, The Korean War, Kim Il-sung's Gamble for Unification. By 1949, Kim Il-sung had established himself as the unchallenged leader of North Korea, officially known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. However, the creation of two Koreas, Communist North Korea under Soviet influence and capitalist South Korea under American support, remained, in Kim's eyes, an unacceptable situation. From the outset of his rule, Kim viewed the division of the Korean peninsula as temporary and believed that unification under his leadership was not only possible but inevitable. This belief, combined with the geopolitical realities of the Cold War, led to one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century, the Korean War. The war, which began on June 25, 1950, would leave millions dead, reshape the political landscape of East Asia, and set the stage for decades of hostility between the two Koreas. Kim Il-sung's preparations for war. In the months leading up to 1950, Kim Il-sung had grown increasingly confident in his ability to reunify the Korean peninsula by military means. Several factors fueled this belief. First, Kim's regime had successfully built a powerful and disciplined army, the Korean People's Army (KPA), which was equipped and trained with the assistance of Soviet advisors. Many KPA soldiers were battle-hardened veterans of the Chinese Civil War, having fought alongside Chinese Communist forces under Mao Zedong. Their experience in guerrilla warfare and conventional combat made them a formidable force. Second, the political situation in South Korea appeared unstable. Syngman Rhee's government faced significant opposition from leftist groups, labor unions, and student activists, who resented its authoritarian policies and close ties to the United States. Rhee's rhetoric about reunifying the peninsula under his rule mirrored Kim's ambitions, but his administration was plagued by corruption and dissent. To Kim, South Korea's internal division seemed like a vulnerability that could be exploited through a swift military campaign. Most critically, Kim needed the approval of his two main allies, the Soviet Union and China. In early 1950, Kim traveled to Moscow to meet with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, presenting his case for an invasion of South Korea. Stalin, though cautious, eventually gave his approval, provided that Kim could secure additional support from Mao Zedong. Stalin's reasoning was strategic. The Soviet leader believed that the United States would not intervene decisively in Korea, particularly after its withdrawal of significant military forces from the region in 1949. Kim then sought Mao's endorsement, recognizing the importance of Chinese support for any military operation. Mao, newly triumphant after the Chinese Communist Party's victory in the Chinese Civil War, agreed to provide assistance. Thus, with the backing of the Soviet Union and China, Kim Il-sung began preparing for what he believed would be a quick and decisive victory. The outbreak of the Korean War. At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, the Korean People's Army launched a massive invasion across the 38th parallel, catching the South Korean forces completely off guard. Kim's strategy was to overwhelm the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, quickly and capture the capital, Seoul, within days. At the time, the North Korean military had a significant advantage in both manpower and equipment. The KPA's forces numbered approximately 135,000 soldiers, many of whom were well-trained and equipped with Soviet tanks, artillery, and small arms. In contrast, the ROKA had fewer than 100,000 troops, many of whom were poorly trained and inadequately armed. Within 3 days, North Korean forces captured Seoul, achieving the first major objective of Kim's plan. The speed and scale of the North Korean advance shocked both the South Korean government and the international community. Syngman Rhee's government, overwhelmed and in disarray, retreated southward, abandoning the capital. The rapid success of the KPA seemed to confirm Kim Il-sung's belief that South Korea would collapse under the weight of his military offensive. However, he had drastically underestimated the international response. The United States and the United Nations intervene. The invasion of South Korea sent shockwaves through the United States and its Western allies. To American policymakers, the attack on South Korea was seen as a direct challenge to the post-World War II order and a test case for containing communism. President Harry S. Truman, adhering to the principles of the Truman Doctrine, quickly decided to intervene. Within days, the United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet Union absent from proceedings due to a boycott, passed resolutions condemning North Korea's aggression and authorizing military action under the UN banner. By early July 1950, American forces began arriving in Korea, joining the remnants of the South Korean army to form a UN coalition. The arrival of U.S. troops marked a turning point in the conflict, as the superior firepower, logistics, and air support of the American military began to slow the North Korean advance. Despite this, the situation remained dire for South Korea. By August 1950, North Korean forces had pushed the UN and South Korean troops into a small defensive perimeter around Pusan, in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. The Battle of the Pusan perimeter became a crucial moment in the war, as the UN forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, managed to hold their ground and prevent a complete North Korean victory. The turning tide, the Incheon landing, the strategic initiative began to shift dramatically in September 1950, when General MacArthur launched a daring amphibious assault at Incheon, a port city located far behind North Korean lines. The Incheon landing, executed on September 15, caught the North Korean military by surprise and proved to be a decisive blow. UN forces quickly recaptured Seoul and began pushing northward, forcing the KPA into a chaotic retreat. By October 1950, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea, with the aim of reunifying the peninsula under South Korean leadership. Kim Il-sung, who had been confident of victory just months earlier, now found himself on the brink of total defeat. Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, fell to UN forces on October 19, and Kim's regime seemed close to collapse. China's intervention saved Kim's regime. Just as Kim's fate appeared sealed, a new player entered the war, China. Alarmed by the rapid advance of UN forces toward its border along the Yalu River, Mao Zedong ordered the intervention of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA. On October 25, 1950, tens of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River, launching a massive counteroffensive against UN forces. The Chinese intervention caught the Americans and their allies off guard. By December, Chinese and North Korean forces had recaptured Pyongyang and pushed UN troops back below the 38th parallel. Seoul fell to Communist forces for the second time on January 4, 1951. The war had devolved into a brutal, back-and-forth struggle that neither side could decisively win. Conclusion of Part 7, Stalemate and the Human Cost. By mid-1951, the Korean War had reached a stalemate. Both sides dug in along the 38th parallel, roughly where the war had begun. For Kim Il-sung, the conflict had exposed the limits of his military ambitions. While his regime survived thanks to Chinese and Soviet intervention, the dream of unifying Korea under his leadership remained unfulfilled. The war's human cost was staggering. Millions of Koreans, soldiers and civilians, were killed, wounded, or displaced. Cities lay in ruins, and the peninsula's economy was devastated. Yet for Kim Il-sung, the conflict solidified his position as North Korea's leader. His regime emerged battered but unbroken, and he would use the war's aftermath to further entrench his authority. Part 8. Post-war Reconstruction and the Cult of Personality, the Korean War, which ended in an armistice on July 27, 1953, left North Korea devastated. Cities like Pyongyang had been reduced to rubble by relentless bombing campaigns, infrastructure was in ruins, and the population faced widespread hunger, homelessness, and dislocation. Yet, in the wake of such destruction, Kim Il-sung emerged stronger than ever. The war, though a failure in achieving his dream of reunification, had solidified his role as the savior of North Korea, a title he would use to build a regime defined by totalitarian control and a near-religious devotion to his leadership. The immediate aftermath of the war, the Korean War officially ended not with a peace treaty but with a ceasefire agreement, leaving the peninsula divided along the demilitarized zone, DMZ, near the 38th parallel. Both North and South Korea remain technically at war, a state of affairs that persists to this day. The years immediately following the armistice were marked by enormous challenges for Kim's government. The economic devastation caused by the war was staggering. Industrial centers had been obliterated, including factories, power plants, and transportation networks. Agriculture was in shambles, leaving the population at risk of starvation. Millions of North Koreans had been killed, injured, or displaced. Despite these challenges, Kim Il-sung portrayed the outcome of the war as a victory for North Korea. Propaganda framed the conflict as a successful defense of Korean sovereignty against imperialist aggression from the United States and its allies. This narrative allowed Kim to rally the population around his leadership and redirect their focus toward rebuilding the nation under his rule. Rebuilding the economy, centralized planning and Soviet aid, Kim Il-sung's strategy for post-war reconstruction was heavily influenced by Soviet-style economic policies. The state took control of all major industries, implementing a centrally planned economy focused on rapid industrialization. Inspired by Stalin's five-year plans in the Soviet Union, Kim introduced ambitious targets for rebuilding North Korea's infrastructure and achieving economic self-sufficiency. Key priorities of the reconstruction effort included heavy industry, factories, steel plants, and power stations were rebuilt with Soviet and Chinese assistance. Agriculture, farms were collectivized into large-scale cooperatives, where land was managed collectively by groups of peasants. This policy aimed to increase food production while reinforcing state control over the rural population. Infrastructure, new roads, railways, and cities were constructed, often through mass mobilization campaigns that relied on the labor of ordinary citizens. The Soviet Union and China provided critical support during this period, supplying financial aid, machinery, technical expertise, and materials. This assistance helped Kim Il-sung position himself as the architect of North Korea's recovery, reinforcing the image of his leadership as both essential and divinely ordained. The rise of the cult of personality, Kim Il-sung's success in consolidating power during the war paved the way for the cult of personality that would define his rule. From the mid-1950s onward, North Korea's political, social, and cultural systems were increasingly reoriented to glorify Kim as the great leader, a title that became synonymous with his near-absolute authority. The cult of personality was carefully constructed through several key strategies: propaganda and education. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public announcements celebrated Kim's leadership, often portraying him as a godlike figure who had single-handedly led Korea to liberation and survival. School curricula were rewritten to focus on Kim's heroic deeds, with children learning from an early age that he was the savior of the Korean people. State-sanctioned mythology, Kim's biography was embellished to elevate his role in the resistance against Japan and the Korean War. Events like the Battle of Pachombo were exaggerated, and his time in Manchuria and the Soviet Union was rewritten to portray him as a flawless, preordained leader. His family's history was mythologized, particularly his marriage to Kim Jong-suk, who was portrayed as a revolutionary heroine and the mother of Korea. Mass mobilization and symbols. Statues of Kim Il-sung were erected in public squares across North Korea, with citizens required to bow or pay homage to them during state ceremonies. Grand monuments, including the Mansa-D Grand Monument in Pyongyang, symbolized Kim's towering presence over North Korean society. His image adorned every building, classroom, and office, reinforcing his omnipresence. Juche ideology. In the 1950s, Kim began promoting Juche, or the ideology of self-reliance, as the foundation of North Korea's political philosophy. Juche emphasized Korean nationalism, independence from foreign influence, and unwavering loyalty to Kim Il-sung as the embodiment of the nation's will. Though inspired by Marxism-Leninism, Juche took on a uniquely Korean character, blending communism with ultranationalist rhetoric. This combination of propaganda, ideological indoctrination, and public displays of loyalty ensured that Kim Il-sung's image became inseparable from the identity of the North Korean state. Political purges and consolidation of power. To secure his dominance, Kim Il-sung embarked on a series of political purges aimed at eliminating rivals and consolidating his grip on the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK. The August Faction Incident of 1956, in which opponents within the party sought to challenge Kim's leadership. Kim responded with brutal efficiency, purging the party of dissenters and solidifying his authority. Continued surveillance and suppression of perceived counter-revolutionary elements, including intellectuals, former landowners, and those suspected of disloyalty to the regime. Under Kim's rule, labor camps, modeled on the Soviet Gulag system, were established to imprison political enemies and their families. These camps became tools of terror, designed to suppress dissent and instill fear throughout North Korean society. Rebuilding national identity. Kim as the eternal leader. By the early 1960s, Kim Il-sung had successfully rebuilt North Korea's economy to levels that, surprisingly, outpaced South Korea's at the time. Heavy industry flourished, and infrastructure projects symbolized progress under Kim's leadership. The relative success of this period was used to further strengthen the narrative that Kim was the only leader capable of guiding the Korean people. Kim's title of Great Leader evolved into that of the Eternal Leader, reflecting the regime's efforts to position him as a timeless and infallible figure. This idea would be taken to even greater extremes in later decades, as his rule became the foundation for a dynastic system in North Korea. Conclusion of Part 8, a leader entrenched in myth. By the mid-1950s, Kim Il-sung had transformed North Korea into a state defined by his personal authority, ideological indoctrination, and centralized control. The post-war reconstruction provided the platform for his emergence not just as a political leader but as a quasi-religious figure, worshipped by his people through state-mandated loyalty. While North Korea's economic recovery earned Kim some genuine praise during this period, the darker undercurrents of his rule, repression, purges, and a growing cult of personality were already setting the stage for decades of isolation and hardship to come. Part 9, Isolation, Economic Stagnation, and the Path to Juche. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Kim Il-sung had successfully consolidated his control over North Korea, cementing his position as the nation's unchallenged leader. Yet, the very nature of his leadership, rooted in authoritarianism, extreme centralization, and ideological indoctrination, was steering North Korea toward a path of increasing isolation and economic stagnation. While Kim's early post-war policies had spurred initial recovery and growth, the rigid application of Juche, or the doctrine of self-reliance, began to exacerbate the country's economic challenges. Coupled with North Korea's fractured relationships with its allies and growing hostility toward the outside world, Kim's vision of creating a self-sufficient socialist utopia would become an enduring burden for the country. The ideological shift to Juche. In the late 1950s, Kim Il-sung began formalizing the ideology that would define his regime, Juche. The term, which translates roughly to self-reliance or autonomy, became a cornerstone of North Korea's political, economic, and cultural systems. Though initially influenced by Marxism-Leninism, Juche evolved into a uniquely Korean ideology that prioritized national independence, loyalty to Kim Il-sung, and economic self-sufficiency. The central tenets of Juche can be summarized as follows: political independence. North Korea must reject foreign influence and chart its own political course, free from outside interference. Economic self-reliance. The nation must develop an independent, centrally planned economy that does not rely on foreign aid or trade. Military strength. A strong and self-sufficient military is essential to defend the country's sovereignty and independence. Juche was more than just a political philosophy, it became an instrument of control. By framing self-reliance as a matter of national pride and survival, Kim Il-sung justified isolationist policies and portrayed external trade, foreign influence, and international cooperation as threats to North Korea's independence. This allowed the regime to consolidate power, stifle dissent, and demand unwavering loyalty from the population. Economic stagnation and the costs of self-reliance. The practical application of Juche proved far more problematic than its ideological appeal. While the 1950s and early 1960s saw notable economic growth in North Korea, fueled largely by Soviet aid, Chinese support, and centralized planning, this progress began to falter as Kim pushed for greater self-sufficiency. Overinvestment in heavy industry. Kim's economic policies prioritized heavy industry, such as steel production, mining, and manufacturing, at the expense of agriculture and consumer goods. While this approach initially produced impressive short-term results, it lacked balance. By neglecting agriculture and essential goods, North Korea struggled to meet the basic needs of its population. Collectivization of agriculture. Kim expanded the collectivization of farms, forcing peasants to work on large state-run cooperatives. While collectivization was presented as a way to increase food production, it often led to inefficiency, mismanagement, and declining crop yields. North Korea's harsh winters and limited arable land compounded these issues, creating chronic food shortages. Isolation from global trade. Juche's emphasis on self-reliance led to policies that minimized North Korea's engagement in international trade. While the Soviet Union and China continued to provide support, North Korea's refusal to participate in global markets limited its access to advanced technology, goods, and investment. By the mid-1960s, the cracks in North Korea's economic system were becoming clear. Despite massive state propaganda campaigns celebrating industrial achievements and self-reliance, the country's economic growth began to stagnate, while inefficiencies and shortages became more pronounced. In comparison, South Korea, under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, had begun its own economic transformation, adopting policies that prioritized industrialization, foreign investment, and export-driven growth. North Korea's growing isolation. As the Cold War intensified, North Korea found itself increasingly isolated, both politically and ideologically. Although Kim Il-sung had once enjoyed strong relationships with both the Soviet Union and China, his insistence on Juche and his refusal to align fully with either power caused tensions to grow. Sino-Soviet split. By the early 1960s, the ideological rift between the Soviet Union and China, known as the Sino-Soviet split, had deepened. The Soviets, under Nikita Khrushchev, began moving away from the rigid policies of Stalinism, advocating for a more moderate and cooperative approach to global communism. Meanwhile, China, under Mao Zedong, rejected these reforms and adhered to a more radical revolutionary stance. Kim Il-sung sought to navigate this divide by maintaining relationships with both nations. However, his attempts to balance these alliances strained North Korea's ties with both powers. The Soviets began reducing economic aid, while China, particularly during its Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, grew distrustful of Kim's regime. Suspicion of foreign influence. Kim's commitment to Juche further isolated North Korea. Foreign diplomats, cultural exchanges, and even technical assistance were viewed with suspicion, as the regime feared that outside influences might undermine its control. Borders were tightly sealed, and propaganda reinforced the idea that North Korea stood alone as a beacon of independence in a hostile world. The cult of personality reaches new heights. As North Korea became increasingly isolated, Kim Il-sung doubled down on efforts to consolidate his rule through an ever-expanding cult of personality. By the mid-1960s, Kim's image had permeated every aspect of North Korean life. Statues and portraits, massive statues of Kim Il-sung were erected in public squares, while his portraits adorned homes, schools, and workplaces. Citizens were required to maintain and clean these images as acts of loyalty. State propaganda, films, books, and newspapers celebrated Kim as the great leader who had liberated Korea, defended it from imperialism, and guided it toward a glorious future. His leadership was portrayed as infallible and divinely ordained. Mandatory loyalty rituals. Citizens were expected to participate in public demonstrations of loyalty, such as mass rallies, choreographed performances, and ideological study sessions that focused on Kim's teachings. Kim's regime also promoted historical myths that depicted him as a revolutionary hero whose leadership had been central to Korea's resistance against Japanese imperialism. Events such as the Battle of Pochombo were celebrated as defining moments of his military brilliance, while his years in exile were rewritten to emphasize his leadership and sacrifice. Preparing for dynastic rule, by the late 1960s, Kim Il-sung began laying the groundwork for what would become a dynastic succession, a unique development in the communist world. Unlike other Marxist-Leninist states, where leadership transitions were theoretically based on collective decision-making, Kim sought to ensure that power would remain within his family. His eldest son, Kim Jong-il, was quietly groomed as his successor, though this process would not become public until the 1970s. This move reflected Kim's desire to solidify his family's dominance over North Korea and perpetuate the cult of personality he had built. The transition from a revolutionary regime to a hereditary dictatorship would become one of Kim Il-sung's most enduring legacies. Conclusion of Part 9: Isolation and the Path Ahead. By the end of the 1960s, Kim Il-sung's North Korea had become an isolated, highly controlled state defined by the principles of Juche, economic stagnation, and the overwhelming dominance of its leader. While Kim's propaganda machine continued to portray the country as a beacon of independence and self-sufficiency, the realities of food shortages, inefficiencies, and growing isolation were beginning to take their toll. The foundations of modern North Korea, totalitarian control, economic autarky, and the cult of Kim Il-sung, had been firmly established. Yet, these very systems would also lay the groundwork for the economic crises and hardships that North Korea would face in the decades to come. Part 10: The 1970s, Kim Il-sung as president and the shaping of a dynasty. By the dawn of the 1970s, Kim Il-sung had firmly established himself as the undisputed leader of North Korea. His regime, built upon the foundations of Juche ideology, totalitarian control, and an all-encompassing cult of personality, now entered a new phase, the formalization of North Korea as a dynastic state under Kim's rule. Politically, economically, and culturally, every element of life in North Korea became further aligned with Kim's vision, even as cracks began to emerge beneath the surface. The 1970s also marked a period of international ambition for Kim, as North Korea sought recognition on the global stage and aligned itself with other socialist and post-colonial nations. Meanwhile, at home, Kim's consolidation of power reached new heights, solidifying the Kim family as the axis around which North Korean society revolved. The 1972 Constitution and Kim Il-sung as president. A significant milestone in Kim Il-sung's regime came with the promulgation of North Korea's Socialist Constitution on December 27, 1972. This new constitution formalized many of the policies and structures that had already been implemented under Kim's leadership. More importantly, it elevated Kim to an even higher position within the North Korean state by creating the office of President of the DPRK. Key features of the 1972 Constitution included Kim Il-sung's role as supreme leader. The constitution enshrined Kim as the great leader and the president of North Korea, granting him virtually unlimited powers as head of state, head of the military, and leader of the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK. Juche as state ideology. Juche was officially codified as the guiding principle of the North Korean state, emphasizing self-reliance, nationalism, and loyalty to Kim. Centralized control. The constitution formalized the structure of a one-party state, where all political and economic power was concentrated in the hands of Kim and his inner circle. Symbolic rights. The document spoke of universal education, equality, and human rights, but these were purely rhetorical, serving to reinforce the image of Kim's government as benevolent and progressive. Kim's transition from premier to president was accompanied by an intensified focus on his leadership as the central element of North Korea's identity. His speeches, writings, and supposed accomplishments were compiled into volumes of Kim Il-sung works, which became mandatory reading for all citizens. Statues, murals, and portraits of Kim proliferated across the country, and his image became inseparable from the very concept of the North Korean state. The Juche Tower, a monument to self-reliance, in 1982, to mark Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday, North Korea unveiled the Juche Tower in Pyongyang, a monumental symbol of the Juche ideology. Standing 170 meters tall, the tower dominates the skyline of the capital and serves as a constant reminder of Kim's leadership and his vision for self-reliance. The tower's construction reinforced the notion that Kim was not merely a political leader but the architect of North Korea's ideological foundation. Beneath the surface, however, the contradictions of Juche were becoming more apparent. While Kim preached self-reliance, North Korea remained heavily dependent on economic aid and trade with the Soviet Union and China. Kim's refusal to engage meaningfully with the global economy placed an increasing strain on the country's resources, leading to inefficiencies and stagnation. International ambitions and alliances. The 1970s also saw Kim Il-sung pursue a more assertive foreign policy as North Korea sought to expand its influence and secure allies among newly independent nations in the developing world. Kim positioned North Korea as a model of socialist self-reliance, offering technical assistance, military training, and economic aid to countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Key developments during this period included relations with post-colonial nations. North Korea built ties with nations such as Egypt, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Angola, presenting itself as a champion of anti-imperialism and decolonization. Kim developed a particularly close relationship with Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, supplying arms and support during the Arab-Israeli conflict. Solidarity with socialist states. While relations with the Soviet Union and China remained tense due to Kim's insistence on Juche, North Korea continued to maintain alliances with other socialist countries, including Cuba under Fidel Castro and Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu. Global propaganda. North Korea engaged in extensive propaganda efforts abroad, promoting Kim Il-sung as a visionary leader and the DPRK as a model for other nations to emulate. These efforts often masked the country's economic challenges and human rights abuses. While Kim's international ambitions brought North Korea temporary prestige among like-minded regimes, they also drained resources that could have been used to address domestic problems. North Korea's financial and military aid to foreign allies often exceeded its means, deepening the strain on its economy. Preparing for succession. The rise of Kim Jong-il. By the late 1970s, Kim Il-sung began preparing for the next phase of his leadership, the transfer of power to his eldest son, Kim Jong-il. Unlike in other communist states, where leadership transitions were theoretically based on collective decisions by party elites, Kim sought to establish a hereditary succession that would ensure his family's control over the country. Kim Jong-il's rise was carefully orchestrated over many years. He was given senior positions within the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, and became responsible for overseeing propaganda, cultural affairs, and the security apparatus. State propaganda began promoting Kim Jong-il as the dear leader, a title that emphasized his connection to Kim Il-sung while preparing the population to accept him as the natural heir. Kim Jong-il was credited with major cultural and ideological achievements, including the development of the monolithic ideological system, which demanded absolute loyalty to the Kim family. The emergence of Kim Jong-il as the successor marked the formal beginning of the Kim dynasty, a unique phenomenon in the communist world. While North Korea remained nominally a socialist state, it was increasingly governed as a family dictatorship, with power concentrated entirely within the Kim lineage. Conclusion of Part 10, The Shaping of a Dynasty. By the end of the 1970s, Kim Il-sung had transformed North Korea into a state that was not only defined by his leadership but entirely dependent on it. Through the 1972 constitution, the expansion of Juche, and the cultivation of a vast cult of personality, Kim had entrenched himself as the unassailable leader of the country. At the same time, the foundations of the Kim dynasty were being laid, as Kim Jong-il emerged as the heir to his father's rule. This dynastic transition, unprecedented in the communist world, ensured that Kim Il-sung's legacy would endure long after his death. Yet, beneath the facade of ideological purity and state control, North Korea's economic and political vulnerabilities were becoming more apparent. The challenges of the 1980s, economic stagnation, increased isolation, and the growing cult of the Kim family, would set the stage for the most tumultuous period in North Korea's modern history. Part 11, The 1980s, Economic Struggles and Kim Il-sung's Final Years. By the dawn of the 1980s, Kim Il-sung had ruled North Korea for over 3 decades. He stood at the helm of a nation whose very identity had been shaped in his image. North Korea was now fully entrenched in the grip of the Juche ideology, while the cult of personality surrounding Kim continued to grow to near-messianic proportions. However, beneath the veneer of ideological purity and stability, significant cracks were emerging in North Korea's economic and geopolitical landscape. The global political shifts of the 1980s, including rising tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, coupled with China's pivot toward market-oriented reforms under Deng Xiaoping, placed Kim Il-sung in an increasingly precarious position. His refusal to adapt or compromise left North Korea isolated and unprepared for the challenges that lay ahead. Economic stagnation and mismanagement. Throughout the 1980s, North Korea's economic stagnation deepened. The initial gains made during the 1950s and 1960s had long since evaporated, and the country's centrally planned economy was now plagued by inefficiency, corruption, and poor management. Kim's emphasis on heavy industry and military spending continued to divert resources away from agriculture, consumer goods, and infrastructure development. Key factors contributing to the economic decline included over-reliance on foreign aid. Despite the rhetoric of self-reliance, North Korea remained dependent on economic and technical aid from the Soviet Union and China. However, by the 1980s, both nations began reducing their support. The Soviet Union, under Leonid Brezhnev and later Mikhail Gorbachev, shifted its focus to internal reforms, while China moved toward economic liberalization. Lack of modernization. Kim's commitment to Juche discouraged technological and industrial innovation. Factories and infrastructure fell into disrepair, while outdated Soviet-era equipment became increasingly inefficient. Unlike South Korea, which embraced foreign investment and modernization, North Korea lagged behind. Agricultural failures. Collectivized farming, combined with North Korea's limited arable land, resulted in persistent food shortages. Agricultural productivity stagnated, and the government's efforts to mask the problem through propaganda left many citizens undernourished and vulnerable. Excessive military spending. North Korea maintained one of the largest standing armies in the world relative to its population, pouring enormous resources into building a military-industrial complex. While this bolstered Kim's image as the defender of Korean independence, it drained the economy of much-needed resources. By the mid-1980s, it had become clear that North Korea was falling further behind its southern neighbor. South Korea, under the leadership of President Chun Doo-hwan and subsequent administrations, had emerged as an economic powerhouse, driven by industrial exports, foreign investment, and technological innovation. The growing disparity between the two Koreas stood in stark contrast to Kim's propaganda, which continued to depict North Korea as a model of socialist success. International isolation, North Korea, and the changing Cold War. On the international stage, the 1980s were a period of profound change that left North Korea increasingly isolated. Kim Il-sung's regime, once buoyed by support from the Soviet Union and China, found itself adrift as its traditional allies pursued new priorities. Soviet reforms under Gorbachev. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and introduced a series of reforms known as perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness. Gorbachev's policies represented a direct challenge to Kim's rigid, authoritarian model. More importantly, the Soviet Union began reducing its economic and military aid to North Korea, prioritizing its own domestic recovery. Kim Il-sung viewed Gorbachev's reforms with suspicion, fearing that such changes might undermine his authority. North Korean propaganda vilified the Soviet Union's newfound openness, and relations between Pyongyang and Moscow grew increasingly strained. China's economic reforms. Under Deng Xiaoping, China embraced market-oriented reforms that transformed its economy. By the 1980s, China was opening its doors to foreign investment and pursuing policies that prioritized economic growth over ideological purity. Kim Il-sung, however, rejected these reforms, viewing them as a betrayal of socialist principles. Relations with China remained cordial but cool, as North Korea distanced itself from its once close ally. Limited alliances with developing nations. While North Korea sought to maintain relationships with socialist and post-colonial nations, its ability to provide meaningful economic or military support was increasingly limited. Kim's efforts to position North Korea as a leader of the non-aligned movement brought limited success, but did little to address the regime's isolation. Escalation of the cult of personality. As economic and diplomatic challenges mounted, Kim Il-sung intensified his efforts to maintain control through the cult of personality. The state's portrayal of Kim as the great leader reached new heights in the 1980s, as propaganda emphasized his infallibility and his central role in North Korea's survival. Citizens were required to memorize Kim's speeches, study his writings, and participate in mass rallies celebrating his leadership. Statues, portraits, and monuments dedicated to Kim proliferated further, with every town and village expected to display symbols of his rule. Songs, poems, and theatrical productions glorified Kim's accomplishments, blending propaganda with art to reinforce his divine status. This period also saw the further elevation of Kim Jong-il as Kim Il-sung's successor. By the late 1980s, Kim Jong-il had taken on greater responsibilities within the Workers' Party of Korea, overseeing propaganda, security, and cultural affairs. His rise was carefully orchestrated to present him as the dear leader, the natural heir to his father's legacy. The Rungrado 1st of May Stadium, a monument to grandeur, one of the most ambitious projects of the 1980s, was the construction of the Rungrado 1st of May Stadium in Pyongyang. Completed in 1989, the stadium was built to showcase North Korea's grandeur and ambition. With a capacity of 150,000 spectators, it remains the largest stadium in the world to this day. The stadium's construction was part of Kim's efforts to portray North Korea as a powerful and successful nation, capable of grand achievements despite its economic struggles. It was also used for mass propaganda events, including the Arirang Festival, where tens of thousands of performers participated in elaborate displays celebrating Kim's leadership and the achievements of the DPRK. The twilight of Kim Il-sung's rule. By the late 1980s, Kim Il-sung was approaching his late 70s, and his once dominant regime faced growing challenges. The economic stagnation, coupled with North Korea's isolation from the changing global order, created mounting hardships for ordinary citizens. Food shortages became more frequent, infrastructure crumbled, and the disparity between North and South Korea became impossible to ignore. At the same time, Kim remained outwardly confident and unyielding. He continued to project an image of strength and stability, dismissing calls for reform and blaming North Korea's struggles on foreign aggression and imperialist plots. His speeches called for unwavering loyalty to the state and to Juche, even as the country's foundations began to weaken. Conclusion of Part 11, The Calm Before the Storm. The 1980s marked the final full decade of Kim Il-sung's rule, a period characterized by economic decline, international isolation, and an ever-intensifying cult of personality. While North Korea's challenges were growing, Kim's grip on power remained firm, thanks to the totalitarian systems he had spent decades building. As the world entered the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War would deliver a final, devastating blow to North Korea's economy. Kim Il-sung, though nearing the end of his life, would oversee one of the most difficult periods in North Korea's history. Part 12, The Collapse of the Soviet Union and Kim Il-sung's Final Years. By the dawn of the 1990s, North Korea, under Kim Il-sung's leadership, faced an unprecedented crisis. For decades, Kim had maintained his regime's stability through Soviet aid, Chinese support, and the ideological framework of Juche. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the broader dissolution of communist regimes across Eastern Europe sent shockwaves through the global political order. For North Korea, it marked the beginning of an era of economic catastrophe, deepening isolation, and mounting hardships for its people. As Kim Il-sung entered the final years of his life, his leadership was defined by a desperate struggle to hold on to power, maintain the cult of personality, and ensure a smooth dynastic succession to his son, Kim Jong-il. These efforts came against the backdrop of a world that was rapidly changing and leaving North Korea behind. The collapse of the Soviet Union. North Korea loses its lifeline. The Soviet Union had been North Korea's most critical economic and political ally since the end of World War II. For decades, the Soviets had provided North Korea with economic aid, technical expertise, and trade subsidies, all of which propped up Kim's centrally planned economy. However, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union pursued policies of glasnost, political openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, in an effort to modernize and liberalize its society. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was in a state of political and economic collapse. Gorbachev's reforms inadvertently led to the unraveling of the communist bloc, as satellite states in Eastern Europe rejected Soviet influence and embraced democratic reforms. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, marking the end of the Cold War. For North Korea, the consequences were devastating. Loss of economic aid, Soviet financial assistance, which had long sustained North Korea's economy, evaporated almost overnight. Subsidized fuel, machinery, and food imports were cut off, leaving North Korea unable to maintain its industries or feed its population. Trade disruption. With the collapse of the Soviet bloc, North Korea lost access to its primary trading partners. The country's rigid economic system, focused on heavy industry and military production, was ill-suited to adapt to this sudden isolation. Diplomatic isolation. The end of the Cold War reshaped global alliances. Russia, now led by Boris Yeltsin, sought closer ties with the United States and other Western powers, leaving North Korea without its traditional ally. Kim Il-sung refused to acknowledge the need for reform. While other socialist states in Asia, such as China and Vietnam, embraced market-oriented policies to modernize their economies, Kim clung to the ideals of Juche and centralized planning. State propaganda continued to insist that North Korea was thriving under Kim's leadership, even as the country descended into economic chaos. Mounting economic crisis and famine. The collapse of Soviet support left North Korea unable to meet even the most basic needs of its people. The agricultural sector, which had already struggled under collectivization policies, fell into a state of crisis. Several factors contributed to this growing catastrophe. Lack of resources. Without subsidized fuel and machinery from the Soviet Union, North Korea's agricultural output plummeted. Farmers lacked the tools, fertilizers, and fuel needed to produce sufficient crops. Natural disasters. The situation was worsened by a series of floods and droughts in the early 1990s, which devastated farmland and further reduced food supplies. Mismanagement and priorities. Despite the growing food crisis, Kim's regime continued to prioritize military spending and grandiose infrastructure projects over the needs of ordinary citizens. By the mid-1990s, this economic collapse would culminate in a catastrophic famine, known as the Arduous March, that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of North Koreans. While the famine occurred primarily after Kim Il-sung's death, its roots lay in the economic policies and isolationist strategies of his regime during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Kim Il-sung's focus on succession. As the world changed and North Korea's challenges mounted, Kim Il-sung turned his attention to securing the dynastic succession of his son, Kim Jong-il. Unlike in other communist states, where leadership transitions were framed as collective decisions, Kim sought to establish his family as a hereditary ruling dynasty, an unprecedented development in a Marxist-Leninist system. By the early 1990s, Kim Jong-il had already been groomed for leadership for more than a decade. His rise was carefully managed through propaganda that emphasized his loyalty to his father and his contributions to the state. He was portrayed as the dear leader, second only to Kim Il-sung, the great leader. To ensure a smooth transition, Kim Il-sung gradually transferred responsibilities to his son, particularly in the areas of military oversight and internal security. This process was accompanied by an intensified cult of personality around both leaders, reinforcing the idea that the Kim family was uniquely destined to lead the Korean people. Attempts at diplomacy, seeking survival. In his final years, Kim Il-sung made limited attempts to engage with the outside world, recognizing the need for diplomatic flexibility as North Korea's isolation deepened. Negotiations with the United States. In the early 1990s, North Korea's burgeoning nuclear program became a focal point of international concern. The United States, under President Bill Clinton, engaged in negotiations with Pyongyang to address the issue. Kim Il-sung's regime viewed its nuclear program as both a deterrent against external threats and a bargaining chip for securing economic concessions. Relations with South Korea. In a rare moment of thaw, Kim Il-sung expressed willingness to engage in talks with South Korea. Plans were underway for a historic inter-Korean summit aimed at reducing tensions and exploring possibilities for cooperation. These efforts, however, were cut short by Kim's sudden death in 1994. Kim Il-sung's death and legacy. On July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung suffered a fatal heart attack at his country retreat near Pyongyang. He died at the age of 82, bringing an end to his decades-long rule over North Korea. His death was met with orchestrated displays of grief across the country, as state propaganda portrayed him as the eternal father of the Korean people. Kim's body was preserved and enshrined in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, a massive mausoleum in Pyongyang that had originally been constructed as his official residence. Today, the palace stands as a symbol of his enduring cult of personality, with citizens required to pay homage to their eternal president. Conclusion of Part 12. Kim Il-sung's final years. Kim Il-sung's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy would live on through the system he created. North Korea remained a state defined by isolation, economic hardship, and a relentless cult of personality. Kim's son, Kim Jong-il, inherited a nation on the brink of collapse, with the challenges of famine, economic failure, and international isolation looming large. While Kim Il-sung is remembered as a revolutionary leader by North Korean propaganda, the reality of his rule is far darker. His policies set the stage for decades of suffering, his refusal to reform left the economy in ruins, and his obsession with power created a system that prioritized loyalty to the Kim dynasty over the well-being of the people. Part 13, The Legacy of Kim Il-sung and the Transition to Kim Jong-il. The death of Kim Il-sung on July 8, 1994, marked a profound turning point for North Korea. Though his physical presence was gone, his legacy and the system he created ensured that his influence would endure for decades to come. His son, Kim Jong-il, inherited a country on the brink of collapse, yet the regime itself, built upon a foundation of ideological indoctrination, brutal authoritarianism, and an unrelenting cult of personality, remained intact. Kim Il-sung's passing did not bring about change or reform, as some had hoped. Instead, North Korea's political, economic, and social structures became even more entrenched under the leadership of his successors. This part examines Kim Il-sung's long-term legacy, the immediate impact of his death, and the transition to his son, Kim Jong-il. Eternal President, the deification of Kim Il-sung. One of Kim Il-sung's most striking legacies was the deification of his image after death. In a move that solidified the Kim family's permanent hold on power, Kim was posthumously declared Eternal President of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. No other leader would ever hold the title of president, ensuring that Kim Il-sung's authority remained eternal in both name and practice. This decision was deeply symbolic. It reinforced the quasi-religious cult surrounding Kim Il-sung, elevating him to a godlike figure whose guidance transcended death. It allowed the regime to justify the hereditary succession to Kim Jong-il, framing it as the continuation of Kim Il-sung's eternal leadership. Citizens were encouraged, if not required, to view Kim Il-sung as the father of the nation, whose wisdom and sacrifice guided North Korea through its most challenging periods. Kim's preserved body was placed in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, now a massive mausoleum and pilgrimage site. Citizens were required to visit the palace to pay respects to their great leader, and his image continued to dominate every aspect of public life. Statues, murals, and portraits of Kim remained omnipresent, while his speeches and writings were treated as sacred texts to be studied and revered. Kim Jong-il's rise, a carefully orchestrated transition. The transition from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il was the first dynastic succession in a Marxist-Leninist state, an unprecedented development that underscored North Korea's uniqueness in the communist world. Kim Jong-il's rise to power had been carefully prepared over 2 decades, with his father ensuring that the transfer of authority would be seamless. Key steps in Kim Jong-il's grooming for leadership included consolidation of power. By the late 1970s, Kim Jong-il had been placed in charge of propaganda, the military, and internal security. His rise was depicted as both natural and inevitable, with state propaganda promoting him as the dear leader and the chosen successor. Cult of personality. The cult of Kim Il-sung was extended to include Kim Jong-il, who was portrayed as his father's loyal and capable heir. Stories and myths about Kim Jong-il's birth and achievements were carefully crafted to reinforce his legitimacy. Ideological continuity. Kim Jong-il embraced his father's policies, particularly Juche and the emphasis on self-reliance. This ensured that his leadership was seen as a continuation of Kim Il-sung's eternal guidance. Upon Kim Il-sung's death, Kim Jong-il assumed de facto control of the country. While he did not immediately take on the title of president, out of respect for his father's eternal position, he wielded absolute authority as the chairman of the National Defense Commission, the supreme military body in North Korea. The crisis of the 1990s, famine and isolation. Kim Jong-il inherited a country in crisis. Kim Il-sung's rigid policies and refusal to adapt had left North Korea ill-prepared for the economic shocks of the post-Cold War world. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the reduction of Chinese support exacerbated the country's economic decline, while Kim Il-sung's emphasis on military spending had drained resources away from essential sectors like agriculture and infrastructure. In the mid-1990s, North Korea was plunged into a devastating famine known as the Arduous March. The famine, which began during Kim Il-sung's final years, reached catastrophic levels under Kim Jong-il's rule. Key factors included Agricultural collapse, collectivized farming, outdated equipment, and natural disasters, such as floods and droughts, resulted in widespread crop failures. Economic isolation. Without access to foreign aid or trade, North Korea was unable to import food or resources to address the crisis. Government mismanagement. The regime prioritized military programs and elite survival over the needs of ordinary citizens, exacerbating the suffering of the population. Estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 3 million people died as a result of the famine. While Kim Il-sung's death shielded him from direct blame, the policies he implemented, particularly the emphasis on self-reliance and isolation, were central to the crisis. Kim Il-sung's legacy. A nation shaped in his image, Kim Il-sung's rule left a profound and enduring impact on North Korea, shaping every aspect of the country's political, economic, and cultural systems. His legacy can be summarized as follows. The cult of personality. Kim Il-sung's leadership created one of the most pervasive and enduring cults of personality in modern history. His image became synonymous with the state itself, and his deification ensured his eternal authority over North Korea. The Juche ideology. Kim's emphasis on self-reliance became the cornerstone of North Korea's identity, guiding its policies even as the country descended into isolation and hardship. Totalitarian control. Kim established a system of absolute control, characterized by surveillance, propaganda, and political repression. Dissent was brutally suppressed, and loyalty to the regime was enforced at all levels of society. Economic failure. While Kim oversaw initial periods of economic growth, his policies ultimately led to stagnation, inefficiency, and collapse. The focus on heavy industry and military spending came at the expense of agriculture and consumer welfare. The Kim dynasty. Kim Il-sung's greatest legacy was the establishment of a hereditary dictatorship. By passing power to his son, Kim Jong-il, he ensured that the Kim family would remain at the center of North Korean politics for generations to come. Conclusion. Kim Il-sung's death in 1994 marked the end of one of the longest and most consequential dictatorships of the 20th century. His rule shaped North Korea into a nation defined by isolation, authoritarian control, and a deeply entrenched cult of personality. While his propaganda machine painted him as the great leader and savior of the Korean people, the reality of his leadership was far darker. A reign marked by economic mismanagement, brutal repression, and policies that brought immense suffering to his people. The transition to Kim Jong-il ensured that Kim Il-sung's system would endure. North Korea remained a totalitarian state, guided by Juche and the legacy of its founding leader. The challenges of famine, economic collapse, and international isolation that followed were direct consequences of Kim Il-sung's refusal to adapt or reform. Even today, Kim Il-sung's shadow looms large over North Korea. His name, image, and ideology continue to define the country, perpetuated by his descendants and the system he created. For better or worse, Kim Il-sung remains the single most significant figure in the history of modern Korea, a leader whose impact will be felt for generations to come. Kim Jong-il, the architect of North Korea's isolation and survival. Part 1. Early life of Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il's early life unfolded against the backdrop of a rapidly changing world, shaped by the upheavals of war, revolution, and the intense ideological struggle that characterized the mid-20th century. His birth and upbringing have been subjects of both historical inquiry and state propaganda, with conflicting narratives reflecting the stark divide between documented accounts and the mythos constructed by the North Korean regime. These formative years, marked by personal tragedy, displacement, and the shadow of his father's revolutionary ambitions, laid the foundation for his eventual emergence as one of the most enigmatic and controversial leaders in modern history. Birth and disputed origins. The circumstances surrounding Kim Jong-il's birth are clouded by discrepancies between Soviet records and the official North Korean narrative. According to archival documents, Kim was born in 1941 under the name Yuri Kim. This name reflects his family's connection to the Soviet Union during their time in exile, where his father, Kim Il-sung, was a prominent guerrilla leader aligned with communist forces. His birthplace is also contested, with some sources identifying the Vyatsky camp near Khabarovsk and others pointing to the Voroshilov camp near Nikolsk as possible locations. The timing and location of Kim's birth have been debated extensively by historians. Lim Jae-cheon, a prominent scholar on North Korean history, argues that Kim's birthplace was most likely Voroshilov, based on the documented movements of Kim Il-sung, who resided in the area prior to relocating to Vyatsky in July 1942. This conclusion challenges the official North Korean account, which claims that Kim Jong-il was born on February 16, 1942, in a secret military camp on Mount Pektu. The Mount Pektu narrative holds immense symbolic significance in North Korean propaganda. As a revered site in Korean culture and history, the mountain is associated with national pride and resistance against foreign domination. By situating Kim's birth at this sacred location, the regime sought to construct a narrative that tied the Kim family to the very essence of Korean identity. This origin story also positions Kim Jong-il as a natural heir to his father's revolutionary legacy, portraying him as a child born in the crucible of anti-Japanese resistance. Family dynamics and early challenges. Kim Jong-il's parents played pivotal roles in shaping his early life. His father, Kim Il-sung, was already emerging as a central figure in the Korean Communist movement, known for his leadership in guerrilla campaigns against Japanese colonial forces. His mother, Kim Jong-suk, was equally influential, revered for her dedication to the revolutionary cause and her role as a supportive partner to Kim Il-sung. Within the family, Kim Jong-il was affectionately called Yura, a diminutive of his Russian name, while his younger brother, Kim Man-il-noi, was nicknamed Shura. These names highlight the family's deep ties to the Soviet Union, which provided both refuge and resources during their years in exile. Despite the apparent unity of the family, Kim Jong-il's early life was not without its difficulties. The family's constant movement, dictated by Kim Il-sung's revolutionary activities, created an unstable environment. Additionally, the hardships of exile and the constant threat of Japanese reprisals loomed large over their lives. These challenges, combined with the weight of his father's expectations, would have a profound impact on Kim Jong-il's psyche and worldview. Tragedy struck early in Kim's life with the death of his mother in 1949. Kim Jong-suk reportedly died from complications related to an ectopic pregnancy, leaving a young Kim Jong-il and his siblings without their maternal figure. Her death was a significant loss, depriving the family of a stabilizing presence and forcing Kim Il-sung to balance his revolutionary ambitions with his responsibilities as a father. The absence of his mother likely intensified Kim Jong-il's reliance on his father, deepening his understanding of the burdens and sacrifices associated with leadership. The return to Korea and post-war upheaval. The end of World War II in 1945 marked a seismic shift in the Korean peninsula's history. As Japanese colonial rule collapsed and the region entered a period of profound transformation. For the Kim family, this was both a moment of triumph and a new chapter in their revolutionary journey. Kim Il-sung returned to Pyongyang in September 1945, welcomed as a hero by many Koreans who viewed him as a symbol of liberation. Later that year, Kim Jong-il and the rest of his family followed, traveling aboard a Soviet ship to the port of Sunbong. The family's arrival in Pyongyang marked the beginning of their ascent to power. They settled in a former Japanese officer's mansion, a grand residence that stood in stark contrast to the widespread poverty and devastation experienced by most Koreans in the post-war period. The mansion, complete with a garden and swimming pool, symbolized the privileges that accompanied Kim Il-sung's rising status as a political leader. However, life in Pyongyang was not without its challenges. In 1948, tragedy struck again when Kim Jong-il's younger brother, Kim Man-il-noi, drowned in the pool of their family home. This devastating loss, compounded by the earlier death of his mother, deeply affected the young Kim Jong-il and further shaped his understanding of the fragility of life and the importance of family. A childhood of contrasts, Kim Jong-il's early years were defined by a stark contrast between privilege and hardship. On one hand, he grew up in an environment of relative comfort and influence, shielded from the struggles faced by ordinary Koreans. On the other hand, he experienced significant personal losses and the pressures of being the son of a revolutionary leader. These contradictions shaped his identity, instilling in him a sense of duty to his family's legacy while also fostering a deep understanding of the sacrifices required to maintain power. The interplay of these factors, personal tragedy, political ambition, and the mythology surrounding his birth, served as the foundation for Kim Jong-il's eventual rise to power. His early life was not merely a prelude to his leadership but a critical period that shaped his character and his approach to governance. As the son of Kim Il-sung, he inherited not only the privileges of his family's status but also the immense expectations that came with it. Kim Jong-il's childhood offers a window into the complex interplay of history, ideology, and personal experience that defined his life. From his contested origins to his formative years in Pyongyang, his early life reflects the broader dynamics of a nation struggling to redefine itself in the aftermath of colonial rule and war. Part 2: Education and Political Involvement. Kim Jong-il's education and early political activities were pivotal in shaping the leader he would become. His formative years, spent under the shadow of his father Kim Il-sung's growing political dominance, saw him develop not only an understanding of North Korea's ideological framework but also the skills required to navigate its complex political landscape. The interplay of privilege, ideological indoctrination, and early exposure to governance defined this critical period of his life. Early education amid uncertainty. Kim Jong-il's official biography asserts that he completed his general education between September 1950 and August 1960. During this time, he is said to have attended primary school No. 4 and middle school No. 1, later known as Namsan Higher Middle School, in Pyongyang. These institutions were among the most prestigious in North Korea, reserved for the children of the elite. The curriculum emphasized not only academic subjects but also ideological instruction, with a particular focus on loyalty to the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, and its leadership. The historical context of Kim's early education cannot be ignored. His schooling coincided with the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, a conflict that devastated the peninsula and cemented the division between North and South Korea. The war had a profound impact on North Korean society, and its effects were deeply felt in Pyongyang, which faced extensive bombing campaigns by United Nations forces. During this period, many members of the ruling elite, including Kim Jong-il, were reportedly evacuated to safer locations. Some foreign scholars suggest that Kim spent part of his childhood in the People's Republic of China, where he may have received an education designed to protect him from the dangers of the war. The possibility of Kim being educated in China adds an intriguing dimension to his formative years. If true, this experience would have exposed him to Chinese culture, language, and political ideology, broadening his perspective while also reinforcing the close ties between the Chinese Communist Party and North Korea during this era. This exposure, however, remains a matter of speculation, as official North Korean accounts omit any reference to such an arrangement. Indoctrination and political activities. From a young age, Kim Jong-il was deeply immersed in the ideological tenets of the WPK. His involvement in the Korean Children's Union and later the Democratic Youth League, DYL, provided him with an early platform to engage in political activities. These organizations served as training grounds for future party members, emphasizing Marxist-Leninist principles, Juche, self-reliance, and unwavering loyalty to the Kim family. In September 1957, Kim was appointed vice chairman of his middle school's DYL branch. While the chairmanship of the branch was traditionally reserved for a teacher, Kim's position as vice chairman was a significant acknowledgement of his political potential. During this period, he reportedly organized study groups focused on Marxist theory and spearheaded anti-factionalist campaigns among his peers. These activities not only reflected his commitment to party ideology but also demonstrated his early understanding of the importance of unity and loyalty within the WPK. Kim's education extended beyond the classroom, as he frequently accompanied his father to public events and political meetings. These experiences provided him with first-hand exposure to the workings of the party and the mechanics of power. Observing Kim Il-sung's leadership style and his ability to command loyalty undoubtedly influenced Kim Jong-il's approach to governance in later years. Extracurricular influences and foreign exposure. While North Korean propaganda emphasizes Kim's academic achievements and ideological dedication, other accounts suggest that he had interests and experiences that extended beyond the rigid confines of party doctrine. For instance, it is reported that Kim received English language instruction during his infrequent trips abroad, including a period in the early 1970s when he studied in Malta. Hosted by Maltese Prime Minister Dom Mintoff, these visits exposed Kim to Western culture and diplomacy, providing him with insights into international relations and the functioning of foreign governments. Kim's time in Malta, though brief and sporadic, is noteworthy because it contrasts sharply with the isolationist policies he later championed as a leader. His exposure to a different political and cultural environment may have informed his later diplomatic strategies, including his approach to dealing with Western powers. This duality, an understanding of the outside world juxtaposed with an unwavering commitment to North Korea's insular ideology, became a defining feature of his leadership. Family dynamics and early rivalries. Kim Jong-il's formative years were also shaped by the dynamics within his family, particularly the tensions that arose as Kim Il-sung's family grew. After the death of Kim Jong-suk, Kim Il-sung remarried and had another son, Kim Pyong-il. This addition to the family introduced an element of rivalry, as both sons were potential successors to their father's leadership. Kim Pyong-il, often described as charismatic and popular, was seen as a potential competitor to Kim Jong-il. However, Kim Jong-il's strategic acumen and proximity to Kim Il-sung ensured that he remained the favored heir. Reports suggest that Kim Jong-il frequently informed his father of any actions by Kim Pyong-il that could be interpreted as disloyal or ambitious, such as hosting parties where guests reportedly chanted slogans in his favor. These reports led to Kim Pyong-il being sidelined and eventually assigned to diplomatic posts in Europe, far from the centers of power in Pyongyang. This early rivalry underscores Kim Jong-il's ability to navigate complex political relationships and eliminate potential threats to his position. His actions during this period demonstrate a level of political sophistication that would later define his leadership style. Preparation for leadership. By the time Kim Jong-il graduated in 1960, he was already well versed in the ideological and political principles that underpinned North Korea's governance. His education, both formal and informal, equipped him with the tools needed to navigate the challenges of leadership. More importantly, his close association with Kim Il-sung and his active involvement in party activities positioned him as a natural successor to his father. Kim Jong-il's early political involvement was marked by a keen awareness of the importance of loyalty, discipline, and ideological purity. These values, instilled in him during his youth, would become central to his governance as he rose through the ranks of the WPK. His ability to blend intellectual rigor with strategic maneuvering allowed him to consolidate his position within the party and lay the groundwork for his eventual ascent to power. Part 3. Initial career and ascension to power. Kim Jong-il's rise to power within the North Korean political hierarchy was a calculated process that required him to navigate the complex dynamics of loyalty, ideology, and internal party struggles. While he benefited immensely from his position as the eldest son of Kim Il-sung, his ascent was not without obstacles. Through a combination of strategic alliances, ideological purges, and a relentless focus on consolidating power, Kim Jong-il emerged as the unquestioned heir to his father's revolutionary legacy. Joining the Workers' Party of Korea, Kim Jong-il officially joined the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, in July 1961, marking the formal beginning of his political career. His entry into the party was carefully orchestrated, as he was positioned to rise through its ranks as a protege of his father. At the time, the WPK was the central institution of power in North Korea, controlling all aspects of governance, military strategy, and ideological propagation. For Kim Jong-il, joining the party was not merely a formality but a critical step in establishing his presence within the political elite. Throughout the 1960s, Kim's responsibilities within the party gradually expanded. He took on roles in various departments, focusing particularly on propaganda and ideological education. These areas aligned closely with his interests, as they allowed him to shape the narrative around his father's leadership and begin building his own image as a dedicated revolutionary. This period also saw Kim deepen his understanding of the party's inner workings, particularly the importance of loyalty and the elimination of factionalism. The Kapsan faction incident, a turning point, one of the most significant events in Kim Jong-il's early political career, was the Kapsan faction incident of 1967. This internal party struggle involved a group of senior officials, known as the Kapsan faction, who sought to challenge Kim Il-sung's authority. They criticized his policies and advocated for reforms that would reduce the concentration of power within the Kim family. For Kim Jong-il, this incident was both a threat and an opportunity. Kim played a prominent role in the investigation and purges that followed the exposure of the Kapsan faction. At just 26 years old, he was entrusted by his father with the task of identifying and eliminating dissent within the party. This assignment marked the first time Kim Jong-il was given official duties of significant consequence, signaling Kim Il-sung's growing confidence in his abilities. Kim's involvement in these purges showcased his ruthlessness and his understanding of the importance of ideological unity. He delivered his first major speech during the plenum that followed the purges, further establishing himself as a rising star within the party. His name began to appear in public documents for the first time, indicating that his role within the regime was no longer confined to behind-the-scenes activities. The Kapsan faction incident also allowed Kim Jong-il to align himself closely with his father's cult of personality. By participating in the suppression of dissent, Kim positioned himself as a loyal defender of Kim Il-sung's revolutionary vision. This alignment would become a cornerstone of his political strategy, as he sought to link his legitimacy to his father's legacy. Leadership in propaganda and cultural affairs. In the aftermath of the Kapsan faction incident, Kim Jong-il was tasked with revitalizing North Korea's cultural and propaganda apparatus. His leadership in this area marked a significant expansion of his influence, as he took control of the narratives that shaped public perception of the regime. One of Kim's first major initiatives was to reform the North Korean film industry. Recognizing the power of cinema as a tool for propaganda, he personally supervised the production of films that glorified his father's leadership and the revolutionary struggle. He is credited with authoring On the Art of the Cinema, a book that outlines his vision for the role of film in promoting party ideology. Under Kim's guidance, the film industry became a critical component of North Korea's propaganda machine, producing works that celebrated the Kim family's leadership and reinforced the principles of Juche. Kim's contributions to cultural affairs extended beyond cinema. He oversaw the production of operas, plays, and other cultural materials, all of which were designed to bolster the regime's image. These efforts not only intensified the cult of personality surrounding Kim Il-sung, but also laid the groundwork for Kim Jong-il's own mythos as a visionary leader. The succession question. As Kim Jong-il's influence within the WPK grew, the question of succession began to take center stage. By the early 1970s, Kim Il-sung was contemplating who would inherit his leadership, and Kim Jong-il emerged as the most likely candidate. However, his path to succession was not guaranteed, as several other figures within the regime posed potential challenges to his ascent. One of the most significant rivals was Kim Jong-ju, Kim Il-sung's younger brother. As a senior official within the party, Kim Jong-ju had significant influence and was once considered the natural successor. However, his position weakened over time due to his perceived mistakes and his inability to build a strong base of support. Another potential rival was Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-il's half-brother. Charismatic and popular, Kim Jong-il was seen as a serious contender for leadership. However, Kim Jong-il skillfully neutralized this threat by reporting incidents that portrayed Kim Jong-il as disloyal, such as hosting parties where guests reportedly chanted slogans in his favor. These reports led to Kim Jong-il's reassignment to diplomatic posts in Europe, effectively removing him from the political arena. By the mid-1970s, Kim Jong-il's position as heir apparent was solidified. In 1974, the Central Committee of the WPK officially designated him as the successor to Kim Il-sung. This decision was publicly confirmed in 1977 when party documents began referring to him as the only heir to his father's leadership. The process of succession was further reinforced by Kim Jong-il's increasing control over the party's operations and his growing presence in public life. Consolidation of power. The Sixth Party Congress in October 1980 marked a turning point in Kim Jong-il's political career. By this time, he had assumed senior positions within the WPK, including roles in the Presidium, the Military Commission, and the party secretariat. His control over party operations was nearly complete, and his position as Kim Il-sung's successor was no longer in question. During this period, Kim adopted the title Dear Leader, a designation that highlighted his growing prominence and reinforced the narrative of his indispensability to the regime. The media hailed him as the fearless leader and the great successor to the revolutionary cause, echoing the language used to describe Kim Il-sung. These efforts to build a personality cult around Kim Jong-il were instrumental in ensuring a smooth transition of power. Preparing for leadership, by the late 1980s, Kim Jong-il was effectively running the day-to-day operations of the regime. He was deeply involved in decision-making across all sectors, from economic policy to military strategy. His leadership style, characterized by meticulous attention to detail and an emphasis on loyalty, set the tone for his eventual rule. Kim's ability to navigate the complexities of succession, eliminate potential rivals, and consolidate his authority within the WPK demonstrated his political acumen. By the time he officially assumed leadership following Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, Kim Jong-il was already the de facto leader of North Korea, fully prepared to inherit his father's mantle. Part 4. Leadership and Governance. Kim Jong-il's tenure as the leader of North Korea was a period of deepened autocracy, increased militarization, and intense propaganda. It was marked by significant domestic challenges, including economic collapse and widespread famine, as well as heightened tensions with the international community. Despite these difficulties, Kim managed to maintain absolute control over the state and further entrenched the Kim family's rule, solidifying the dynasty that his father, Kim Il-sung, had established. The transition to supreme leadership. On July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving Kim Jong-il as his undisputed successor. This transition marked the beginning of a new chapter in North Korean history, as Kim Jong-il assumed leadership during a time of profound economic and political crisis. While Kim Il-sung's death was a significant blow to the nation, the groundwork for succession had been meticulously prepared over the preceding decades, ensuring a relatively smooth transfer of power. Kim initially adopted a cautious approach to leadership, allowing the country to mourn the passing of Kim Il-sung while consolidating his authority behind the scenes. He was officially named General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, in 1997, and the National Defense Commission, which he chaired, was declared the highest office of the state. To honor his father's legacy, Kim Jong-il ensured that Kim Il-sung was posthumously named eternal president, a symbolic move that both elevated his father's status and freed Kim Jong-il from direct comparison as a head of state. The arduous march, famine and economic collapse. One of the defining crises of Kim Jong-il's early leadership was the famine of the 1990s, referred to in North Korea as the arduous march. This catastrophic period, caused by a combination of natural disasters, economic mismanagement, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of North Koreans. The exact toll remains uncertain due to the regime's secrecy, but the famine left a profound scar on the nation. Kim's response to the famine was shaped by his military-first, Sungun policy, which prioritized the needs of the armed forces over those of the civilian population. Food and resources were directed toward the military and the ruling elite, leaving ordinary citizens to endure the brunt of the crisis. The famine also led to the rise of informal markets, as desperate North Koreans turned to bartering and smuggling to survive. While international aid organizations eventually intervened, their efforts were tightly controlled by the regime, which feared foreign influence and sought to use aid distribution as a means of reinforcing loyalty. Despite the humanitarian crisis, Kim remained steadfast in his commitment to Juche, self-reliance, rejecting systemic reforms that might undermine the regime's ideological foundation. The Sungun policy and military dominance. Kim Jong-il's Sungun policy became the cornerstone of his governance. Introduced as a response to the challenges of the 1990s, Sungun elevated the military to a central position in North Korean society. The Korean People's Army, KPA, was not only the primary recipient of state resources but also a key player in political decision-making, reflecting Kim's belief that military strength was essential for the survival of the regime. Under Sungun, the military became the dominant institution in North Korea, enjoying privileges and influence that extended far beyond its traditional role. This militarization of society had profound implications for domestic policy, as resources were diverted from civilian sectors to support the armed forces. The policy also shaped North Korea's foreign relations, as Kim pursued a strategy of brinkmanship that relied on the threat of military force to extract concessions from the international community. The nuclear ambitions. One of the most controversial aspects of Kim Jong-il's leadership was his commitment to developing North Korea's nuclear weapons program. This effort began under Kim Il-sung but accelerated significantly during Kim Jong-il's tenure. In 1994, North Korea and the United States signed the agreed framework, which aimed to freeze the country's nuclear program in exchange for aid and the construction of light water reactors. However, the agreement eventually collapsed, and North Korea resumed its pursuit of nuclear weapons. In 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test, a watershed moment that underscored the regime's determination to establish itself as a nuclear power. The test drew widespread condemnation and led to increased sanctions, further isolating the country from the international community. Despite the economic and diplomatic costs, Kim viewed the nuclear program as essential for deterring external threats and ensuring the regime's survival. Economic policies and limited reforms. Economically, Kim Jong-il's leadership was marked by stagnation and inefficiency. The state's commitment to central planning and Juche ideology left little room for innovation or market-driven growth. However, the famine of the 1990s forced the regime to tolerate limited economic activity outside the official system, leading to the emergence of informal markets. In the early 2000s, Kim introduced a series of modest economic reforms, including the establishment of special economic zones and the legalization of some private trade. These measures provided temporary relief, but were insufficient to address the underlying structural issues facing the economy. Moreover, the regime's fear of losing control prevented the implementation of broader reforms, leaving the country heavily reliant on foreign aid and illicit activities, such as smuggling and counterfeit currency production, to sustain itself. One of the most disastrous economic policies of Kim's tenure was the 2009 currency revaluation, which aimed to curb inflation and reassert state control over the economy. The move wiped out the savings of ordinary citizens and led to widespread unrest, forcing the regime to reverse some of the changes. This episode highlighted the fragility of North Korea's economy and the limitations of Kim's approach to governance. Cult of personality and propaganda. Central to Kim Jong-il's leadership was the continuation and expansion of the cult of personality established by his father. State propaganda portrayed Kim as an infallible leader, attributing to him extraordinary abilities and accomplishments. From claims that he composed operas and directed films to stories of his military genius, the regime constructed an image of Kim as a leader of unparalleled wisdom and talent. Kim's birthday, February 16, was declared a national holiday known as the Day of the Shining Star, and mass celebrations were held to honor his leadership. Monuments, songs, and other cultural artifacts were created to glorify him, reinforcing his centrality to the nation's identity. This personality cult not only bolstered Kim's authority but also served as a tool for social control, fostering loyalty and suppressing dissent. Foreign relations and strategic engagement. Kim Jong-il's approach to foreign relations was characterized by a combination of isolationism and strategic engagement. While the regime maintained its rhetoric of self-reliance, it also recognized the need for diplomacy to secure aid and manage tensions. The Sunshine Policy implemented by South Korean President Kim Dae-jung in the late 1990s led to a temporary thaw in inter-Korean relations. The 2000 Inter-Korean Summit in Pyongyang, where Kim met Kim Dae-jung, was a historic event that raised hopes for reconciliation. However, progress was limited, as North Korea's nuclear ambitions and provocations continued to undermine trust. Kim also engaged with China and Russia, securing economic and political support from these traditional allies. His visits to these countries were carefully choreographed, showcasing the regime's resilience while emphasizing its strategic importance in regional geopolitics. Part 5: Death and Legacy. Kim Jong-il's death on December 17, 2011, brought an end to a leadership defined by its mix of rigid control, profound international controversy, and the relentless continuation of his father Kim Il-sung's revolutionary ideology. His legacy, marked by both achievements and atrocities, remains one of the most polarizing in modern history. While he maintained the stability of the North Korean regime and ensured the survival of the Kim dynasty, his governance was characterized by systemic oppression, strategic brinkmanship, and policies that often placed the survival of the regime above the welfare of its people. The issue of abductions of South Koreans and Japanese by North Korea. One of the most internationally contentious and morally reprehensible policies associated with Kim Jong-il's leadership was North Korea's abduction of citizens from other countries, including South Korea and Japan. These acts, which began in the 1950s and continued through the 1980s, were carried out with the aim of advancing the regime's strategic, military, and propaganda objectives. The scale, motives, and long-term consequences of these abductions reflect not only the regime's disregard for international norms but also Kim Jong-il's obsession with maintaining control through unconventional means. South Korean abductions. The abduction of South Korean citizens was a long-standing policy under both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, aimed at destabilizing South Korea, gathering intelligence, and creating a pool of skilled individuals to serve the North Korean regime. These operations were often conducted by the North Korean military and intelligence agencies, targeting fishermen, intellectuals, and even students. Estimates suggest that over 3,800 South Koreans were abducted or forcibly taken to North Korea during Kim Jong-il's tenure alone. Many South Koreans abducted during this period were fishermen who were captured during North Korean raids in the Yellow Sea. These individuals were often transported to North Korea, where they were coerced into labor or indoctrinated into the regime's ideology. The North Korean government used these captives to extract information about South Korean society, economy, and military strategy, often under duress or through forced collaboration. In addition to fishermen, the regime specifically targeted South Korean intellectuals, engineers, and other professionals who could contribute to North Korea's technological and propaganda efforts. Some abductees were forced to teach South Korean customs, dialects, and culture to North Korean spies in preparation for covert operations against the South. This strategic use of abductees highlights the regime's reliance on unorthodox and often brutal methods to achieve its objectives. The families of abducted South Koreans have long sought justice and answers, but North Korea has consistently denied responsibility or refused to provide credible information about their fate. International pressure, particularly from the United Nations and human rights organizations, has repeatedly called for accountability, but the regime has resisted all efforts to address this issue transparently. For the families of the abductees, Kim Jong-il's regime represents an enduring source of trauma, characterized by silence, denial, and impunity. The Japanese abductions, the abduction of Japanese citizens, although smaller in scale compared to South Korean cases, became a high-profile international issue and a significant strain on Japan-North Korea relations. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, at least 17 Japanese citizens were kidnapped by North Korean agents. These individuals were taken from Japanese coastal towns and urban centers, often in daring operations involving subterfuge and coercion. The motives behind the abduction of Japanese citizens were multifaceted. One of the primary objectives was to use these individuals to train North Korean spies. Abductees were forced to teach Japanese language, customs, and societal behaviors to North Korean operatives who were being prepared for covert missions in Japan. Some were used to forge documents, while others were exploited for propaganda purposes, creating materials that portrayed Japan in a negative light to reinforce the regime's ideological narratives. The abduction of Japanese citizens gained international attention due to persistent activism by their families and pressure from the Japanese government. For decades, North Korea denied any involvement in these incidents, dismissing accusations as baseless propaganda by hostile forces. However, in a rare move, Kim Jong-il publicly acknowledged the abductions during a 2002 summit with Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi. This admission marked a significant moment, as it was one of the few instances where North Korea openly admitted to carrying out such acts. During the summit, Kim claimed that the abductions were the work of rogue elements within the regime and expressed regret for their actions. He stated that several of the abductees had died, either due to accidents or natural causes, and allowed 5 of the survivors to return to Japan. While this gesture provided some closure to the families of the 5 returnees, it left many unanswered questions about the fate of the other abductees. North Korea's explanation, which included vague and unverifiable accounts of their deaths, was met with widespread skepticism. The Japanese government, supported by international human rights organizations, has continued to demand accountability and transparency regarding the remaining abductees. However, North Korea has consistently resisted further cooperation, citing the issue as resolved. This lack of resolution has fueled public outrage in Japan, with many viewing Kim Jong-il's admission as a calculated move to ease international pressure rather than a genuine act of contrition. Final years and death. As Kim Jong-il approached the final years of his life, signs of physical decline began to emerge, reflecting the toll of decades spent in power. Reports of a stroke in 2008 raised questions about the stability of his leadership and the future of North Korea. Despite this, Kim remained active in public appearances, albeit less frequently, and continued to oversee state affairs, with characteristic detail and intensity. His later years were marked by a mix of personal health struggles, ongoing challenges within the country, and a determined effort to secure a smooth transition of power to his youngest son, Kim Jong-un. Health issues and speculation. Kim Jong-il's health problems first became apparent to the international community when he failed to appear at a military parade commemorating North Korea's 60th anniversary in 2008. Rumors of a stroke or other debilitating condition quickly circulated, fueled by reports from defectors, foreign intelligence agencies, and occasional leaks from within North Korea. These reports suggested that Kim was undergoing medical treatment, including visits from foreign doctors, and that his mobility and speech had been significantly affected. Despite his health struggles, Kim continued to project an image of strength and control. State media frequently broadcast images of him visiting factories, military units, and farms, often accompanied by high-ranking officials and members of his family. These appearances were carefully choreographed to reassure the North Korean people and the international community that he remained firmly in command. Succession planning. In his later years, Kim Jong-il focused intensely on preparing Kim Jong-un to succeed him. Unlike Kim Jong-il, who had been groomed for decades as his father's heir, Kim Jong-un's rise was rapid and relatively secretive. By 2010, he had been promoted to several senior positions within the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, and the military, signaling his status as the designated successor. Kim's efforts to secure a smooth transition reflected his understanding of the importance of continuity in maintaining the regime's stability. He worked to consolidate Kim Jong-un's authority by introducing him to key members of the party and the military and ensuring that propaganda materials emphasized the younger Kim's connection to the revolutionary legacy of Kim Il-sung. This preparation, while rushed, proved effective in securing Kim Jong-un's position following Kim Jong-il's death. Death and national mourning. On December 17, 2011, Kim Jong-il died of a heart attack while traveling on his private train. The announcement of his death was accompanied by dramatic propaganda, with state media claiming that supernatural phenomena, such as glowing skies and cracks in the ice on Mount Pektu, heralded his passing. These elements were designed to reinforce the mythology surrounding the Kim family and to present Kim Jong-il as a leader whose significance transcended the mortal realm. The nation entered a period of intense mourning, with state-organized ceremonies and mass displays of grief in Pyongyang and other cities. Kim's body was embalmed and placed in the Kumsusan Memorial Palace, alongside his father, Kim Il-sung. The regime declared him the Eternal General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea and the Eternal Chairman of the National Defense Commission, ensuring that his legacy would remain enshrined in North Korea's ideology. The transition to Kim Jong-un's leadership was swift and largely uncontested, a testament to the groundwork laid by Kim Jong-il. The younger Kim was hailed as the great successor, and his ascension marked the continuation of the Kim dynasty, underscoring the dynastic nature of North Korean politics. Kim Jong-il's legacy. Kim Jong-il's legacy is deeply divisive, characterized by a mix of continuity, repression, and strategic maneuvering that left an indelible mark on North Korea and the world. His leadership ensured the survival of the regime during a period of profound challenges, but it also entrenched systemic issues that continue to define North Korea today. Domestic achievements and failures. Domestically, Kim Jong-il's rule was defined by the military-first, Sun-gun policy, which prioritized the armed forces as the cornerstone of the regime. This policy successfully secured the loyalty of the military and reinforced the state's stability, but it came at the cost of widespread poverty and suffering among the civilian population. The famine of the 1990s, known as the Arduous March, remains one of the darkest periods in North Korean history, with millions dying due to starvation and the regime's refusal to seek meaningful reforms or foreign assistance. Economically, Kim's tenure was marked by stagnation and inefficiency. While limited market reforms in the 2000s allowed for the emergence of informal markets and small-scale trade, these measures were insufficient to address the structural problems facing the economy. The 2009 currency revaluation, intended to curb inflation and reassert state control, instead caused chaos and further eroded public trust in the regime. Foreign relations and nuclear legacy. Kim Jong-il's approach to foreign relations was defined by a mix of brinkmanship and strategic engagement. His pursuit of nuclear weapons, culminating in North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006, cemented the country's status as a nuclear power but also deepened its isolation and led to increased sanctions. Despite these tensions, Kim demonstrated a willingness to engage diplomatically when it suited the regime's interests, as seen in his meetings with South Korean leaders during the Sunshine Policy era and his efforts to secure aid from China and Russia. The nuclear program remains one of Kim's most enduring legacies, shaping North Korea's geopolitical strategy and its relations with the international community. While it provided a deterrent against external threats, it also made North Korea a pariah state, with few allies and limited access to global markets. Evaluation of Kim Jong-il. Evaluating Kim Jong-il's leadership requires balancing the internal and external dimensions of his rule, as well as the deeply polarized perspectives that surround his legacy. Strengths and strategic acumen. Kim's ability to maintain the regime's stability in the face of immense challenges reflects his political skill and strategic acumen. He successfully navigated the transition of power following Kim Il-sung's death, consolidated his authority within the party and military, and ensured the continuation of the Kim dynasty. His use of propaganda and the cult of personality demonstrated a deep understanding of the mechanisms of authoritarian control, allowing him to command loyalty and suppress dissent effectively. Criticism and human rights violations. However, these achievements came at a tremendous cost. Kim's leadership was marked by widespread human rights abuses, including the operation of political prison camps, severe restrictions on freedom of movement and expression, and systemic repression of dissent. The famine of the 1990s, exacerbated by the regime's policies, remains a stark indictment of his leadership, highlighting the prioritization of ideology and control over the well-being of the population. Global perception. Internationally, Kim Jong-il is often viewed as a dictator who perpetuated a regime of oppression and instability. His nuclear ambitions and acts of provocation, such as the abductions of foreign citizens, reinforced the perception of North Korea as a rogue state. At the same time, his willingness to engage in diplomacy when it served the regime's interests demonstrated a pragmatic side that often goes overlooked. Conclusion. Kim Jong-il's life and leadership encapsulate the complexities of modern North Korea. A nation defined by its defiance of external pressures, its reliance on repression and propaganda, and its ability to survive against the odds. His legacy is one of profound contradictions, marked by both strategic successes and devastating failures. As North Korea continues under Kim Jong-un's leadership, the impact of Kim Jong-il's policies remains deeply embedded in the nation's political and social fabric, shaping its trajectory for years to come. Kim Jong-un and the Hermit Kingdom, Leadership, Policies, and Global Impact. Part 1. Early life and education of Kim Jong-un, the formation of an enigmatic leader. Kim Jong-un, a figure of intense global scrutiny and speculation, was born into one of the world's most secretive and dynastic regimes. His early life, characterized by deliberate secrecy and shrouded in layers of propaganda, has left historians and analysts piecing together fragmented accounts. The story of his upbringing and education sheds light on the formative influences that shaped the leader who would eventually helm North Korea, one of the most tightly controlled nations on Earth. While official North Korean state narratives insist that Kim Jong-un was born on January 8, 1982, alternative sources, including South Korean intelligence and defectors, suggest that the true date of his birth may be in 1983 or even 1984. This discrepancy is not merely an accident of record-keeping, but an intentional maneuver by the regime to link Kim Jong-un's birth to significant anniversaries. By claiming 1982 as his birth year, the North Korean leadership aligns his life with two monumental milestones in the country's history: the 70th birthday of Kim Il-sung, North Korea's founding leader, and the 40th birthday of his father, Kim Jong-il. These symbolic alignments underscore the importance of the Kim family's legacy and its integration with the revolutionary mythology of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. Born as the second son of Kim Jong-il and Ko Yong-hui, Kim Jong-un was part of a tightly knit but intensely scrutinized family. His mother, Ko Yong-hui, was a Japanese-born ethnic Korean who worked as a dancer before marrying into the ruling family. Her role as Kim Jong-il's consort positioned her children as potential successors, with Kim Jong-un ultimately emerging as the chosen heir. Kim's siblings include his elder brother, Kim Jong-chul, and younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, both of whom also play significant roles in the nation's leadership structure. The Kim family's prominence in North Korea extends beyond governance. They embody the state itself, with their lineage celebrated in songs, monuments, and endless propaganda. Kim Jong-un's ancestry connects him to his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who founded North Korea in 1948 and ruled with an iron grip until his death in 1994. The Kim dynasty has maintained its dominance through a carefully cultivated cult of personality, where each successive leader is portrayed as an almost divine figure. Kim Jong-un's early life was shaped by the weight of this legacy, as well as the expectations placed upon him as a future leader. Unlike his predecessors, Kim Jong-un is the first in his family to have been born after the establishment of North Korea, giving his leadership a unique symbolic resonance within the state's narrative of independence and sovereignty. The Switzerland years, a glimpse into the outside world. Kim Jong-un's childhood and adolescence were marked by an unusual decision that set him apart from most North Koreans. He was educated abroad. Starting in the early 1990s, Kim lived in Switzerland, a country known for its neutrality and high quality of life, offering him a stark contrast to the regimented and austere environment of North Korea. This period of his life provides a rare window into the upbringing of a leader whose actions have profound implications for global politics. To ensure his safety and anonymity, Kim enrolled in schools under pseudonyms, such as Pak Yuen or Kolpak. He initially attended the International School of Bern in Gumlingen from 1993 to 1998, followed by the Liebfeld-Steinholzli State School near Bern from 1998 to 2000. Here, he was presented as the son of a North Korean embassy employee, a cover story designed to protect his true identity. Despite this, some classmates later recalled moments when Kim hinted at his prestigious lineage, though such revelations were rare and often veiled in ambiguity. During his time in Switzerland, Kim Jong-un was described by his peers and teachers as reserved and shy, yet socially adept within small groups. He reportedly developed a strong passion for basketball, becoming an avid fan of the NBA and idolizing players like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. Kim's fascination with basketball went beyond mere fandom. Classmates remembered him as an enthusiastic player who spent hours practicing his skills on the court. This interest in Western sports culture stands in stark contrast to the anti-Western rhetoric that dominates North Korean propaganda. Kim's academic performance, however, was less distinguished. Reports suggest that his grades were mediocre, and his attendance was irregular, reflecting a lack of engagement with traditional academic subjects. Despite this, his time in Switzerland offered him invaluable exposure to a world vastly different from the rigidly controlled environment of North Korea. He interacted with students from diverse cultural backgrounds, experienced the freedoms of Western society, and gained insights into international norms and systems. The contradictions of a young leader in training. Kim Jong-un's upbringing in Switzerland reveals a series of contradictions that continue to define his leadership. While he enjoyed the privileges of a Western education, his life abroad was closely monitored by North Korean security personnel, who ensured that he remained insulated from undesirable influences. This dual existence, freedom within a carefully controlled environment, mirrors the paradoxical nature of his rule. A leader who embraces elements of modernity while fiercely preserving the autocratic traditions of his family. Some accounts from his classmates and teachers paint a picture of a young man grappling with his identity. On one hand, he displayed a fascination with Western culture, including computer games, action movies starring Jackie Chan, and the opulent lifestyles of basketball stars. On the other hand, he remained deeply rooted in the ideology of his home country, with his every move guided by the understanding that he was destined to lead North Korea. In retrospect, Kim Jong-un's time in Switzerland appears to have been a carefully calculated decision by his father, Kim Jong-il, to prepare him for the challenges of leadership. By exposing Kim to the world beyond North Korea, the regime aimed to equip him with the knowledge and perspective necessary to navigate the complex realities of international politics. At the same time, the strict controls placed on his life ensured that he would remain loyal to the values and ideology of the DPRK. A return to isolation. After abruptly leaving Switzerland in 2000, Kim Jong-un returned to North Korea to complete his education and begin his preparation for leadership. Upon his return, he enrolled at Kim Il-sung University, the premier institution in Pyongyang, where he reportedly earned degrees in physics and military studies. These qualifications, while largely symbolic, served to bolster his image as a capable and educated leader in the eyes of the North Korean populace. Kim's return to North Korea marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one defined by intense grooming for the role of supreme leader. Under the watchful eye of his father and key advisors, Kim underwent rigorous training in governance, military strategy, and propaganda. This period also saw the gradual elevation of his public profile, as he began accompanying his father on official visits and participating in state functions. Part 2. The path to leadership and early political career. Kim Jong-un's ascent to power was not merely a product of his lineage, but the result of a carefully orchestrated succession plan designed to perpetuate the Kim dynasty's grip on North Korea. As the youngest son of Kim Jong-il, Kim's rise was neither immediate nor guaranteed. In a regime where power is deeply centralized and loyalty is paramount, the process of grooming a successor required meticulous planning, purges of rivals, and the cultivation of a public image that aligned with the revolutionary mythology of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. Grooming for leadership. Following his return to North Korea in the early 2000s, Kim Jong-un embarked on an intensive period of preparation for his future role as leader. His father, Kim Jong-il, who had ruled North Korea since 1994, was acutely aware of the challenges his successor would face. The country was emerging from the devastating famine of the 1990s, its economy was crippled by sanctions, and its international isolation was deepening due to its nuclear ambitions. Against this backdrop, Kim Jong-il sought to ensure a seamless transfer of power to preserve the regime's stability and legitimacy. During this period, Kim Jong-un was closely mentored by senior officials within the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, and the military. He was also exposed to the intricacies of governance, propaganda, and military strategy. Kim's education at Kim Il-sung University, where he purportedly earned degrees in physics and military studies, served as a symbolic foundation for his leadership credentials. These qualifications, though likely ceremonial, reinforced his image as a leader steeped in the revolutionary and intellectual traditions of the Kim family. Kim's early exposure to state affairs included accompanying his father on field guidance visits, a hallmark of North Korean leadership. These highly publicized tours, during which leaders offer advice and directives at factories, farms, and military installations, are a key element of the country's propaganda apparatus. Through these visits, Kim began to cultivate an image of accessibility and competence, echoing the leadership style of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. The great successor emerges. The first public indications of Kim Jong-un's rise came in the late 2000s, as Kim Jong-il's health began to deteriorate. By 2008, following a series of reported strokes, the elder Kim accelerated efforts to solidify his youngest son's position as heir. This decision was influenced by several factors, including Kim Jong-un's resemblance to his grandfather and the perception that he possessed the decisiveness and charisma necessary to lead. In 2009, Kim Jong-un was reportedly appointed to a key position within the National Defense Commission, a move that signaled his growing influence. Around the same time, propaganda efforts began to elevate his profile, with state media referring to him as the brilliant comrade and encouraging citizens to sing songs in his praise. These initiatives aim to familiarize the North Korean public with their future leader while reinforcing the narrative of dynastic continuity. The pivotal moment in Kim Jong-un's rise came in 2010, during a rare Workers' Party conference in Pyongyang. At this event, he was officially introduced to the public as a high-ranking member of the party and military. He was named vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, a position that underscored his authority over the country's armed forces. He was also appointed to the Central Committee of the WPK, further cementing his status within the regime's inner circle. These appointments marked Kim's formal entry into the highest echelons of power and signaled that he was the chosen successor. Consolidating power, Kim Jong-il's death on December 17, 2011, marked a critical juncture in North Korea's history. Despite the extensive preparations for succession, questions remained about Kim Jong-un's ability to consolidate power and command loyalty. At just 27 or 28 years old, he was significantly younger and less experienced than his father and grandfather when they assumed leadership. Additionally, the entrenched elite within the party and military posed potential challenges to his authority. To address these challenges, the regime orchestrated an elaborate mourning period that emphasized loyalty to the Kim family. State media hailed Kim Jong-un as the great successor and outstanding leader of the party, army, and people. Propaganda efforts portrayed him as a figure of continuity, deeply connected to the revolutionary ideals of his predecessors. The funeral procession for Kim Jong-il, during which Kim Jong-un walked at the front, served as a powerful visual symbol of his ascension. One of Kim's earliest moves as leader was to consolidate his control over the military, a key pillar of power in North Korea. In July 2012, he was promoted to the rank of marshal, the highest active military rank in the country. This promotion, accompanied by a series of purges within the military leadership, sent a clear message about Kim's authority. Notably, Kim replaced key figures associated with his father's rule, such as Chief of General Staff Ri Yong-ho, with loyalists aligned with his vision. A leadership defined by cult of personality. From the outset of his rule, Kim Jong-un adopted the hallmarks of the Kim family's leadership style, emphasizing the cult of personality that had defined his father and grandfather's regimes. North Korean state media lavished praise on Kim, referring to him with titles such as Respected Comrade Kim Jong-un and Marshal Kim Jong-un. These titles, along with the elaborate propaganda campaigns that celebrated his every action, reinforced his image as an almost divine figure. Kim's leadership style also drew heavily on the legacy of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, whose image remains deeply ingrained in North Korean society. By emulating Kim Il-sung's gestures, rhetoric, and public appearances, Kim Jong-un sought to establish a connection with the older generation of North Koreans who remembered the founding leader's era. This strategy not only bolstered his legitimacy but also differentiated him from his father, whose rule was often associated with hardship and isolation. Part 3: Leadership Style and Early Policies. When Kim Jong-un assumed power in December 2011 following the death of his father, Kim Jong-il, the world speculated whether this young and relatively untested leader could maintain control over the tightly structured yet fragile regime. Over the next several years, Kim not only solidified his rule but also left an indelible mark on the leadership style and policy direction of North Korea. His approach reflects a blend of the traditional authoritarianism of the Kim dynasty with efforts to project a modernized, calculated, and charismatic image. This combination of continuity and transformation has defined the early years of his leadership. The consolidation of power, a calculated and ruthless strategy. Kim Jong-un's initial years as leader were characterized by a need to consolidate power in a regime known for its rigid hierarchies and intense loyalty to its supreme leader. At the time of his ascension, Kim was in his late 20s, significantly younger and less experienced than his predecessors. Many analysts questioned whether he could command the same reverence and authority as his father and grandfather, particularly given the entrenched loyalty of senior officials to the previous leadership. To secure his position, Kim employed a dual strategy of calculated patronage and ruthless purges. Within months of taking power, Kim orchestrated the removal of senior officials whose loyalty he deemed questionable. The most prominent example was the 2013 purge and execution of his uncle, Jang Song-theek, once considered the second most powerful man in North Korea. Jang had been a key figure during Kim Jong-il's reign, acting as a mentor to the younger Kim during the transitional period. However, as Kim Jong-un established his authority, Jang was accused of corruption, treason, and factionalism. His highly publicized execution was not only a demonstration of Kim's willingness to wield absolute power, but also a signal to other elites that dissent would not be tolerated. This pattern of purges extended beyond Jang's inner circle. Over the years, numerous officials, military leaders, and even family members have faced imprisonment, exile, or execution. These actions have consolidated Kim's control, eliminating potential rivals and replacing them with loyalists who owe their positions directly to him. Such purges, while brutal, reflect a long-standing tradition within the Kim dynasty of ruling through fear and loyalty, ensuring the unchallenged dominance of the leader. Building a modernized cult of personality. In parallel with his consolidation of power, Kim Jong-un has worked to cultivate a distinct public image that balances traditional elements of the Kim family's cult of personality with a more modern and accessible persona. The cult of personality surrounding Kim is a continuation of the legacy of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and his father, Kim Jong-il. State propaganda portrays Kim Jong-un as a nearly divine figure, referred to by titles such as respected marshal, supreme leader, and dear comrade. Kim's physical resemblance to Kim Il-sung has been emphasized in official media, with carefully curated images that draw parallels between the two leaders. By invoking the memory of his grandfather, who remains a revered figure among older generations of North Koreans, Kim seeks to legitimize his rule and connect himself to the revolutionary origins of the state. Unlike his father, who was known for his reclusive and enigmatic leadership style, Kim Jong-un has adopted a more visible and dynamic approach. He frequently conducts publicized visits to factories, schools, and military installations, engaging with citizens and offering on-the-spot guidance. These visits are designed to showcase Kim as a hands-on leader who is intimately involved in the lives of ordinary North Koreans. State media often depict him inspecting agricultural projects, directing construction efforts, or cheering on workers, reinforcing the narrative of a compassionate and hard-working leader. Kim has also sought to project a more relatable and modern image. He has appeared at public events with his wife, Ri Solju, breaking with the tradition of keeping the leader's spouse out of the public eye. This move humanizes Kim's leadership and presents him as a family-oriented figure, appealing to younger generations. Additionally, cultural initiatives such as the creation of the Moranbong Band, an all-female musical group that blends traditional North Korean themes with elements of Western pop culture, reflect Kim's efforts to modernize the country's image while maintaining ideological control. Economic policies, Byungjin, and the quest for modernization. One of the defining features of Kim Jong-un's early leadership has been the pursuit of Byungjin, a policy that emphasizes the simultaneous development of the economy and the country's nuclear weapons program. This dual-track strategy reflects Kim's recognition of the need to address North Korea's economic challenges while maintaining its military strength as a deterrent against external threats. Under Kim's leadership, North Korea has undergone visible changes in its economic landscape, particularly in Pyongyang. the capital city has seen a construction boom, with modern apartment complexes, shopping centers, and cultural venues transforming its skyline. Projects such as the Mirai Scientist Street and the Ryomyong Street housing developments are showcased as symbols of progress and innovation, serving as propaganda tools to reinforce the regime's claims of economic success. Kim has also introduced limited economic reforms aimed at increasing productivity and efficiency. These measures include granting state-run enterprises greater autonomy in decision-making and allowing collective farms to retain a portion of their output for private sale. While these reforms remain tightly controlled and are limited in scope, they represent a departure from the rigid central planning that has traditionally characterized North Korea's economy. Despite these efforts, the broader economic situation in North Korea remains dire. The country faces severe challenges due to international sanctions imposed in response to its nuclear weapons program. These sanctions have restricted trade, reduced access to foreign currency, and exacerbated shortages of essential goods. The COVID-19 pandemic further compounded these issues, as border closures and reduced economic activity plunged the country into deeper isolation. Military modernization and the role of nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un's leadership is perhaps most defined by his aggressive pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capabilities. These programs have been framed as essential to North Korea's survival, with Kim frequently emphasizing their role as a deterrent against foreign aggression. Under his rule, North Korea has conducted multiple nuclear tests and significantly expanded its missile arsenal, achieving technological milestones that have brought the country closer to its goal of possessing a credible nuclear deterrent. One of the most dramatic moments in Kim's leadership came in 2017, when North Korea tested its first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, the Hwasong-14, capable of reaching the continental United States. This test, followed by the detonation of what North Korea claimed was a hydrogen bomb, marked a turning point in the country's nuclear program. These actions drew widespread international condemnation and led to heightened tensions, including threats of military action from the United States. Despite the risks, Kim has used the nuclear program as a bargaining chip in diplomacy. In 2018 and 2019, he participated in historic summits with South Korean President Moon Jae-in and U.S. President Donald Trump, temporarily easing tensions and raising hopes for denuclearization. While these talks ultimately failed to produce lasting agreements, they showcased Kim's ability to engage directly with world leaders and project an image of North Korea as a legitimate global player. Part 4: Cult of Personality. Kim Jong-un's leadership relies heavily on the cultivation and reinforcement of a cult of personality, a central feature of governance in North Korea since its inception. This strategy ties the legitimacy of his rule to the legacy of his father, Kim Jong-il, and his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, while also carving out a unique space for himself in the national narrative. The elaborate system of propaganda, symbolism, and state rituals serves as a tool to maintain control, inspire loyalty, and elevate Kim as a near-divine figure in the eyes of the North Korean people. The foundations of the Kim cult. The Kim family's cult of personality began with Kim Il-sung, who was portrayed as the eternal president and a godlike revolutionary hero who liberated Korea from Japanese occupation. This image was expanded under Kim Jong-il, who inherited the mantle of supreme leadership and cultivated his own mythology as a military strategist and visionary. By the time Kim Jong-un assumed power, the infrastructure of this cult was deeply entrenched in every aspect of North Korean life. Kim Jong-un's physical resemblance to his grandfather has been exploited by state propaganda to create a sense of continuity. Official portraits and staged appearances emphasize this likeness, with Kim adopting similar gestures, clothing styles, and even rhetorical patterns. This association aims to evoke nostalgia among older generations who regard Kim Il-sung's era as a time of relative stability and growth. Symbolism and ritual. The cult of personality is reinforced through a carefully orchestrated system of symbols and rituals. Portraits of Kim Jong-un are displayed in homes, schools, and public buildings alongside those of his father and grandfather. Citizens are required to bow before these portraits and maintain them in pristine condition, with inspections conducted by local authorities to ensure compliance. State media plays a pivotal role in building Kim's image, portraying him as a leader of unparalleled wisdom, courage, and compassion. News broadcasts and documentaries frequently highlight his on-the-spot guidance visits, where he is shown offering advice to workers, farmers, and military personnel. These scenes are meticulously scripted to present Kim as a hands-on leader who is intimately involved in the lives of his people. Public celebrations and national holidays, such as the Day of the Sun, Kim Il-sung's birthday, and the Day of the Shining Star, Kim Jong-il's birthday, are opportunities to showcase loyalty to the Kim family. These events often feature mass performances, military parades, and fireworks displays, all designed to reinforce the narrative of the Kim family as the saviors and protectors of the nation. The modernization of the cult. While Kim Jong-un has adhered to many traditional elements of the cult of personality, he has also sought to modernize its presentation. He has made public appearances with his wife, Ri Sol-ju, who is often depicted as an elegant and supportive partner. This move breaks with the precedent set by Kim Jong-il, whose personal life was largely kept out of the public eye. By showcasing his family, Kim aims to project a relatable and humanized image to the people. Additionally, Kim has introduced cultural initiatives that blend North Korean traditions with elements of global pop culture. The Moranbong Band, an all-female musical group, performs patriotic songs with Western-style choreography and instruments. These efforts signal an attempt to appeal to younger generations while maintaining the ideological underpinnings of the regime. Part 5, Purges and Executions. Kim Jong-un's consolidation of power has been marked by a series of purges and executions targeting high-ranking officials, military leaders, and even members of his own family. These actions, while brutal, have been effective in eliminating potential threats and reinforcing Kim's authority. The execution of Jang Song-theek, the most infamous purge under Kim Jong-un's rule, was the execution of Jang Song-theek, his uncle by marriage and a prominent figure in the North Korean regime. Jang had been a key advisor to Kim Jong-il and played a significant role during the early stages of Kim Jong-un's leadership. However, in December 2013, Jang was accused of corruption, factionalism, and plotting to overthrow the government. His public arrest during a Politburo meeting and subsequent execution by firing squad were heavily publicized, serving as a dramatic demonstration of Kim's willingness to exercise absolute power. Jang's execution marked a turning point in Kim's leadership, signaling the end of any potential power-sharing arrangements. Reports suggest that Jang's associates and even distant family members were also purged to eliminate his influence entirely. This move not only secured Kim's position but also instilled fear within the elite, ensuring their loyalty. Continued purges and intimidation. Purges have remained a recurring feature of Kim Jong-un's rule. In the years following Jang's execution, numerous military and government officials have been removed or executed, often on charges of disloyalty or incompetence. For example, in 2016, the country's military chief of staff, Ri Yong-il, was reported to have been executed, though he later resurfaced. The use of purges reflects the precarious nature of power in North Korea, where even the highest-ranking officials are not immune to the whims of the leader. These purges serve a dual purpose: they remove potential rivals and reinforce the culture of fear that underpins the regime. By making examples of prominent figures, Kim sends a clear message that dissent will not be tolerated. This strategy, while effective in maintaining control, also highlights the fragility of the regime, where loyalty is enforced through coercion rather than genuine support. Part 6, Human Rights Violations. North Korea under Kim Jong-un has continued to face widespread condemnation for its human rights abuses, which are among the most severe in the world. The regime operates as a totalitarian state, with strict control over every aspect of its citizens' lives. control and repression, freedom of speech, assembly, and religion are non-existent in North Korea, and any perceived dissent is met with harsh punishment. The regime employs an extensive surveillance network to monitor its citizens, with neighbors and even family members encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Those accused of disloyalty are often subjected to public executions or sent to prison camps, where they endure forced labor, starvation, and torture. The prison camps, known as Kwanlaso, are a particularly grim aspect of the regime's human rights record. These camps, where entire families can be imprisoned for the actions of a single individual, house an estimated 80,000 to 120,000 people. Conditions in these camps are dire, with prisoners forced to work long hours under brutal conditions and denied basic necessities such as food and medical care. Part 7. Alleged assassination attempts. Kim Jong-un's leadership, while firmly entrenched, has been marked by a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia and the constant threat of internal and external attempts to undermine his rule. Allegations of assassination attempts against him highlight both the precarious nature of his authority and the extreme measures taken by the regime to ensure his survival. Internal threats to Kim's life. The tightly controlled nature of North Korean society makes it difficult to verify reports of assassination attempts. But accounts have emerged suggesting that potential threats to Kim's life have been taken very seriously by the regime. The government's rigorous security protocols include a personal guard reportedly numbering in the thousands and the use of decoy convoys to thwart potential attacks. Kim rarely announces his movements in advance, and his security team is known for its vigilance and secrecy. One particularly notable incident occurred in 2012, when reports suggested that a machine gun had been discovered hidden near a juniper tree along a route Kim was scheduled to travel. While the details remain speculative, the discovery underscores the regime's acute sensitivity to potential threats. External assassination plots. In 2017, the North Korean government accused the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, of the United States and South Korea's National Intelligence Service, NIS, of orchestrating a plot to assassinate Kim Jong-un. According to North Korean state media, the alleged plot involved the use of a biochemical weapon that would cause delayed effects. The accused perpetrator, identified as a North Korean lumberjack working in Russia, was said to have been recruited by foreign intelligence agencies. While these claims remain unverified, they illustrate the regime's narrative of external threats to justify its isolationist policies and harsh internal security measures. Heightened security measures. Kim's response to perceived assassination attempts has been to further tighten security measures, both for himself and the regime as a whole. These measures include rigorous background checks for those in his inner circle, frequent changes to his personal security detail, and the elimination of individuals deemed even remotely disloyal. Such precautions reflect the intense level of control Kim exerts over his environment, ensuring that any potential threats are neutralized before they materialize. Part 8. Nuclear weapons development. One of the most defining aspects of Kim Jong-un's leadership has been his aggressive pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capabilities. These programs serve as both a cornerstone of North Korea's defense strategy and a critical component of Kim's domestic and international narrative. The evolution of the nuclear program. Under Kim Jong-un, North Korea has made significant advances in its nuclear weapons program, achieving technological milestones that have dramatically altered the regional and global security landscape. Shortly after assuming power, Kim emphasized the importance of nuclear deterrence as a means of safeguarding North Korea's sovereignty against what he described as imperialist aggression. This commitment has been reinforced through a series of high-profile tests and military demonstrations. North Korea's first nuclear test under Kim's leadership occurred in February 2013, just over a year after he came to power. This was followed by additional tests in January and September 2016, and the largest and most powerful test in September 2017, which the regime claimed involved a hydrogen bomb. These tests demonstrated increasing sophistication in North Korea's nuclear technology, raising concerns among international observers about the regime's ability to miniaturize warheads for delivery via ballistic missiles. Intercontinental ballistic missiles. Kim Jong-un's leadership has also seen significant advancements in North Korea's ballistic missile program. The successful test of the Hwasong-14 intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, in July 2017 marked a turning point, demonstrating the regime's ability to potentially strike targets as far away as the continental United States. This was followed by the launch of the Hwasong-15 in November 2017, which further solidified North Korea's status as a nuclear-armed state. These developments have had profound implications for global security, prompting heightened tensions with the United States and its allies. While North Korea maintains that its nuclear weapons are purely defensive, the regime's rhetoric and actions have frequently suggested the possibility of preemptive strikes in the event of perceived threats. Diplomatic engagement and stalemates. Kim's nuclear ambitions have also shaped his approach to diplomacy. In 2018 and 2019, he engaged in a series of high-profile summits with South Korean President Moon Jae-in and U.S. President Donald Trump. These meetings, which marked an unprecedented level of engagement between North Korea and its adversaries, temporarily eased tensions and raised hopes for denuclearization. Despite the symbolic significance of these summits, substantive progress was limited. North Korea insisted on the lifting of sanctions as a precondition for denuclearization, while the United States and its allies demanded verifiable steps toward disarmament before providing concessions. The breakdown of these negotiations in 2019 signaled a return to the status quo, with North Korea continuing its weapons development and escalating its rhetoric. Strategic importance of nuclear weapons. For Kim Jong-un, nuclear weapons are more than just a means of defense, they are a critical tool for ensuring the survival of his regime. The possession of a credible nuclear deterrent allows North Korea to project strength on the international stage, demand concessions in diplomatic negotiations, and reinforce the narrative of self-reliance that underpins the regime's ideology. While the international community has sought to curb North Korea's nuclear ambitions through sanctions and diplomatic pressure, Kim has remained steadfast in his commitment to these programs. This defiance reflects his belief that nuclear weapons are essential to maintaining the regime's sovereignty and deterring foreign intervention. Part 9. The global and domestic impact of Kim's policies. Kim Jong-un's leadership, defined by his pursuit of nuclear weapons, consolidation of power, and modernization efforts, has had far-reaching consequences for both North Korea and the world. Domestically, Kim has worked to position himself as a transformative leader who combines traditional values with a vision for progress. Internationally, his actions have reshaped geopolitical dynamics, forcing countries to confront the challenges posed by an increasingly assertive and nuclear-armed North Korea. At home, Kim's policies have brought visible changes to Pyongyang, where new infrastructure and cultural initiatives showcase the regime's attempts to project an image of progress. However, these developments are overshadowed by widespread poverty, human rights abuses, and the devastating effects of international sanctions. For ordinary North Koreans, life under Kim's rule remains defined by hardship and repression. Globally, Kim's leadership has solidified North Korea's position as a key player in international security discussions. His willingness to engage in high-stakes diplomacy, coupled with his commitment to military strength, has forced the world to take North Korea seriously as a strategic actor. While this has elevated Kim's status on the global stage, it has also deepened the country's isolation, as the regime's actions continue to provoke condemnation and sanctions. Part 10. Foreign Relations, Navigating Alliances, Tensions, and Strategy. Under Kim Jong-un's leadership, North Korea's foreign relations have been a blend of aggression, strategic diplomacy, and shifting alliances. While the country remains one of the most isolated in the world, Kim has managed to leverage North Korea's nuclear program and its geopolitical position to engage with key global powers, including China, South Korea, the United States, and Russia. These relationships, often fraught with tension and complexity, are central to understanding North Korea's strategies and survival under Kim's rule. Relations with China. The strained ties of tradition. China has long been North Korea's most important ally and economic lifeline, a relationship rooted in shared ideology and historical alliances. During the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, China provided critical military support to North Korea, and since then, the two nations have maintained a partnership based on mutual interests and strategic necessity. However, Kim Jong-un's aggressive pursuit of nuclear weapons and his often unpredictable behavior have strained these ties. Initially, relations between North Korea and China cooled after Kim assumed power in 2011. Beijing, traditionally Pyeongchang's main benefactor, expressed growing frustration with North Korea's nuclear tests and ballistic missile launches, which destabilized the region and invited harsh international sanctions. China, concerned about regional stability and its economic priorities, condemned North Korea's nuclear activities in 2013, 2016, and 2017. It also implemented United Nations Security Council sanctions, including a ban on imports of North Korean coal, Pyeongchang's main export commodity. In an unprecedented move, North Korea's state media criticized China in 2017, accusing it of big power chauvinism and betraying their traditional friendship. This rare public denunciation highlighted the widening rift between the two allies. Despite these tensions, the relationship improved in 2018 when Kim embarked on a series of diplomatic efforts. He visited Beijing in March 2018, marking his first foreign trip since assuming power. The meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping was followed by additional visits in May and June of the same year, signaling a thaw in relations. These meetings underscored the mutual recognition of the need to maintain strategic ties, with China reaffirming its support for North Korea's security and stability. In 2019, Xi Jinping made a historic visit to Pyongyang, the first by a Chinese leader in over a decade, further solidifying the renewed partnership. While tensions over nuclear issues persist, China continues to play a pivotal role in propping up the North Korean economy, offering limited support to mitigate the impact of international sanctions. Relations with South Korea. Fluctuations between dialogue and hostility. North Korea's relationship with South Korea under Kim Jong-un has been marked by dramatic shifts between reconciliation and antagonism. Initially, Kim's rule was characterized by military provocations, including nuclear tests and border skirmishes, which heightened tensions on the Korean peninsula. However, in 2018, a series of inter-Korean summits raised hopes for improved relations and even potential peace. In his 2018 New Year's address, Kim signaled a willingness to engage with South Korea, leading to North Korea's participation in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. This event served as a diplomatic breakthrough, with athletes from both Koreas marching together under a unified flag during the opening ceremony. Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, played a prominent role as a representative of the North, marking the first visit by a member of the ruling family to the South. This period of diplomacy culminated in 3 summits between Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. The April 2018 meeting in Panmunjom produced the Panmunjom Declaration, which pledged to formally end the Korean War and pursue denuclearization. Subsequent meetings in May and September reinforced commitments to reducing military tensions and increasing economic cooperation. However, these efforts stalled in 2019 following the collapse of nuclear negotiations between North Korea and the United States. Kim's regime grew increasingly frustrated with South Korea's inability to deliver economic benefits due to sanctions. By 2020, relations deteriorated further, with North Korea cutting off communication lines and demolishing a joint liaison office near the border in a symbolic display of anger. In 2023, Kim declared South Korea an enemy during a Workers' Party meeting, accusing its government of pursuing unification by absorption under U.S. influence. This shift reflects the ongoing volatility of inter-Korean relations, where progress remains contingent on broader geopolitical dynamics. Relations with the United States, from fire and fury to diplomacy. North Korea's relationship with the United States during Kim Jong-un's rule has been one of the most closely watched aspects of his leadership. Initially marked by escalating tensions and threats of war, this relationship took an unprecedented turn with the historic summits between Kim and then-President Donald Trump. The early years of Kim's rule saw heightened hostilities, with North Korea conducting nuclear and missile tests that drew harsh rhetoric from the U.S. Trump's administration responded with a maximum pressure campaign, involving stricter sanctions and military threats. The two leaders exchanged heated insults, with Trump referring to Kim as Rocket Man, and Kim calling Trump a dotard. The situation reached a boiling point in 2017, raising fears of a potential military conflict. However, 2018 marked a dramatic shift as both sides pursued diplomacy. In June 2018, Kim and Trump held a historic summit in Singapore, the first ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. The summit produced a joint statement committing to the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, though specifics were vague. Subsequent summits in Hanoi, 2019, and the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, failed to achieve meaningful progress. While Kim sought relief from sanctions in exchange for partial denuclearization, the U.S. insisted on complete disarmament before lifting economic restrictions. The breakdown of negotiations left relations at an impasse, with neither side willing to compromise. Despite the lack of tangible outcomes, these summits were significant in elevating Kim's status as a global leader and demonstrating his ability to engage with the world's most powerful nation. However, since 2020, U.S.-North Korea relations have returned to a state of mutual hostility, with North Korea resuming weapons testing and rejecting overtures from the Biden administration. Relations with Russia, strengthening ties amid global isolation. North Korea's relationship with Russia, while less prominent than its ties with China, has grown stronger under Kim Jong-un. Russia, like China, has historically supported North Korea as a counterbalance to U.S. influence in the region. In April 2019, Kim met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Vladivostok, marking his first summit with the Russian leader. The meeting underscored shared interests in countering U.S. sanctions and fostering economic cooperation. Russia expressed support for North Korea's security concerns and called for a phased approach to denuclearization. The relationship deepened further in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. North Korea publicly supported Russia, blaming the war on U.S. hegemonism and recognizing the independence of breakaway regions in Ukraine. Reports also suggest that North Korea has supplied Russia with military equipment, including artillery shells, in exchange for economic aid. In 2023, Kim visited Russia's Vostochny Cosmodrome, where he pledged continued support for Russia's sacred fight against the West. This growing alignment reflects both countries' shared opposition to U.S. dominance and their mutual need for strategic partnerships. Kim Jong-un's foreign relations strategy reflects a delicate balancing act between aggression and diplomacy. His ability to engage with world leaders, combined with his willingness to defy international norms, has reshaped North Korea's position on the global stage. While his efforts to secure economic and security benefits have met with mixed results, Kim's leadership has solidified North Korea's role as a key player in regional and international politics, despite its continued isolation. Part 11: COVID-19 Pandemic, Crisis, Propaganda, and Leadership. The COVID-19 pandemic posed unprecedented challenges for North Korea under Kim Jong-un's leadership, exposing the fragility of the country's healthcare system and testing the regime's ability to maintain control amid global upheaval. While most nations openly acknowledged the pandemic's impact and sought international cooperation, North Korea adopted a strategy of denial, stringent isolation, and extensive propaganda to manage both the health crisis and its narrative. Initial denial and strict border closures. When the COVID-19 outbreak began in early 2020, North Korea was one of the first countries to implement strict border closures, effectively sealing itself off from the outside world. The regime halted trade, suspended travel, and imposed draconian quarantine measures on anyone entering the country. These actions, while extreme, reflected the regime's fears that an outbreak could devastate the country's poorly equipped healthcare system, which lacks the resources to handle a large-scale pandemic. North Korea's state media initially claimed that the country had no confirmed cases of COVID-19, a claim met with skepticism by international observers. Experts pointed to the country's proximity to China, where the virus first emerged, and its porous borders as indicators that COVID-19 had likely infiltrated North Korea. However, the regime maintained its narrative, using the absence of reported cases to bolster its image of control and competence. Kim Jong-un's public response. Kim Jong-un took a highly visible role in managing the pandemic, using it as an opportunity to reinforce his leadership and emphasize the regime's commitment to protecting its citizens. In speeches and public meetings, Kim praised the efforts of health and security officials while warning of the virus's potential dangers. He also framed the pandemic as a test of North Korea's revolutionary spirit and self-reliance, portraying the country's isolation as a source of strength. Despite his public confidence, reports emerged of significant disruptions within the country. Trade with China, a crucial lifeline for North Korea's economy, plummeted due to the border closures. Food shortages worsened, and the regime imposed further restrictions on movement and commerce, exacerbating the hardships faced by ordinary citizens. In April 2020, Kim's prolonged absence from public appearances sparked rumors about his health, with some speculating that he was seriously ill or dead. While these rumors were ultimately unfounded, they highlighted the regime's opacity and the heightened global interest in North Korea's handling of the crisis. Acknowledgement of cases and domestic turmoil. In May 2022, North Korea officially reported its first COVID-19 outbreak, declaring a maximum emergency after cases of fever were detected in Pyongyang. The announcement marked a significant shift in the regime's approach, as it could no longer plausibly deny the virus's presence. Kim held emergency meetings, ordered nationwide lockdowns, and mobilized emergency medical supplies in response to the crisis. State media described the outbreak as a great turmoil, with daily reports of fever cases numbering in the hundreds of thousands. While the regime blamed the crisis on incompetence among local officials and even suggested foreign interference, it also used the situation to rally citizens around the leadership. Kim personally oversaw the response and appeared in public wearing a mask, a rare acknowledgement of the severity of the situation. Propaganda and claims of victory. By mid-2022, North Korea's state media declared the pandemic under control, attributing the success to Kim Jong-un's brilliant leadership and the population's disciplined adherence to guidelines. Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, even claimed that Kim himself had contracted and recovered from the virus, presenting him as a self-sacrificing leader who had suffered alongside his people. However, these claims were met with widespread skepticism. Observers noted the lack of transparency, the absence of widespread testing, and the near-total isolation of the country, which made it impossible to verify the regime's assertions. Additionally, reports from defectors and humanitarian organizations suggested that the pandemic had caused significant suffering, with many citizens facing food shortages and inadequate medical care. Long-term impact. The pandemic's effects on North Korea were profound, exacerbating existing economic challenges and deepening the country's isolation. Trade with China remained limited, and the continued closure of borders hindered efforts to smuggle goods, further straining the informal markets on which many North Koreans rely. Kim Jong-un used the pandemic to reinforce themes of self-reliance and loyalty, framing the crisis as evidence of North Korea's resilience in the face of global adversity. However, the long-term consequences of the pandemic, including its impact on the economy and public health, remain uncertain. For a regime already grappling with sanctions and domestic hardships, the COVID-19 crisis highlighted both the vulnerabilities and adaptability of Kim Jong-un's leadership. Part 12, Personal Life. Kim Jong-un's personal life, while tightly controlled by state secrecy, has been a subject of fascination and speculation around the world. North Korean state media presents only carefully curated glimpses into his domestic life, focusing on his role as a leader and minimizing personal disclosures. However, certain details have emerged that provide insight into his private world. In 2012, North Korean state media confirmed that Kim was married to Ri Sol-ju, marking the first time in the country's history that the leader's spouse was publicly acknowledged. Ri, believed to be in her late 20s or early 30s at the time of their marriage, is a former singer and is often described as graceful and well-educated. Her public appearances with Kim have been a departure from the practices of Kim's father and grandfather, who largely kept their personal lives hidden. Ri is frequently seen accompanying Kim at state events, projecting an image of a modern, family-oriented leader. Despite the relative openness regarding Ri Sol-ju, little is known about the rest of Kim's private life. Reports suggest that he and Ri have 3 children, though their identities remain undisclosed. Dennis Rodman, the former NBA star who visited North Korea in 2013, mentioned meeting Kim's daughter, Juche, and described her as cute and lovely. Kim's children are believed to be kept away from public life for their safety and to preserve the mystique of the ruling family. Personality. Kim Jong-un's personality has been described by those who have interacted with him as a mix of confidence, shrewdness, and calculated charm. Despite the grim realities of his rule, he has demonstrated a surprising sense of humor and attentiveness in diplomatic settings, characteristics that contrast sharply with his authoritarian image. South Korean officials who met him during inter-Korean summits in 2018 described him as direct, pragmatic, and occasionally humorous. Kim's personality appears to mirror elements of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, whose approachable demeanor and charisma played a significant role in building his cult of personality. However, Kim Jong-un's leadership style also reveals a ruthlessness reminiscent of his father, Kim Jong-il, particularly in his handling of perceived threats and dissent within the regime. Accounts from Dennis Rodman paint Kim as socially reserved yet warm in personal interactions. Rodman described Kim as an avid basketball fan with a deep appreciation for Western pop culture, particularly the NBA and action films. These interests hint at a complex personality shaped by both the rigid ideology of his upbringing and his exposure to Western influences during his time in Switzerland. Public image. Kim Jong-un's public image is meticulously crafted through North Korea's extensive propaganda apparatus. State media portrays him as a benevolent and visionary leader, closely involved in all aspects of governance, from economic development to military strategy. His frequent on-the-spot guidance visits, where he is shown giving advice to workers and inspecting factories, are designed to present him as a hands-on and compassionate ruler. Kim has sought to project a more dynamic image than his father, appearing in public with his wife and embracing modern cultural initiatives, such as the Moranbong Band. These efforts aim to humanize him and appeal to younger generations, while reinforcing the traditional narrative of the Kim family as the saviors of the Korean people. Internationally, Kim's image is far more polarizing. While his role as a nuclear-armed leader has drawn condemnation, his engagement in high-profile summits with world leaders like Donald Trump and Moon Jae-in has showcased his ability to navigate global diplomacy. These events have elevated his status as a strategic actor on the world stage, even as his regime's human rights abuses and isolationist policies draw criticism. Wealth. Kim Jong-un's personal wealth, much like his private life, is shrouded in secrecy, but reports suggest that he enjoys a lifestyle of immense luxury, contrasting starkly with the poverty endured by many North Koreans. The ruling family's fortune is believed to come from a combination of state-controlled enterprises, illicit trade, and access to state resources. Kim reportedly owns multiple palatial residences across the country, a fleet of luxury vehicles, private jets, and yachts. His lavish lifestyle became a point of international scrutiny when it was revealed in 2018 that he had acquired armored Mercedes-Maybach S600 sedans, despite strict sanctions prohibiting the import of luxury goods into North Korea. The vehicles, valued at around $500,000 each, were smuggled through a complex international network. Kim is also known for his love of fine cuisine, imported liquor, and expensive gadgets. Defectors and insiders have reported that the ruling family maintains an exclusive supply chain for high-end goods, ensuring that Kim and his inner circle live in comfort even as ordinary citizens face food shortages and economic hardship. Health. Kim Jong-un's health has been a subject of speculation and concern, both domestically and internationally. Reports suggest that he suffers from obesity-related health issues, including high blood pressure and diabetes. His visible weight fluctuations and occasional absences from public events have fueled rumors about his well-being. In 2014, Kim disappeared from public view for 6 weeks, leading to widespread speculation about his health. When he re-emerged, he was seen walking with a cane, and state media later confirmed that he had been suffering from an uncomfortable physical condition. Similar episodes occurred in 2020 and 2021, with Kim's prolonged absences sparking rumors of illness or even death. In recent years, Kim's weight loss has drawn attention, with analysts speculating that he may be addressing his health issues. State media has portrayed his slimmer appearance as a result of his hard work and sacrifices for the nation, framing it as a testament to his dedication to the people. Family. Kim Jong-un's family plays a significant role in his leadership, both symbolically and operationally. His younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, has emerged as one of his closest confidants and most powerful aides. She holds key positions within the Workers' Party of Korea and has been a prominent figure in inter-Korean diplomacy, often acting as Kim's emissary. Kim's extended family has also been a source of intrigue and controversy. His half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, who fell out of favor after attempting to visit Tokyo Disneyland on a fake passport, was assassinated in Malaysia in 2017 in an operation widely believed to have been ordered by Kim Jong-un. The killing underscored the ruthlessness with which Kim has dealt with potential rivals. Within his immediate family, Kim's wife, Ri Sol-ju, and their children remain largely out of the public eye. This carefully managed privacy serves to protect them and maintain the mystique surrounding the Kim dynasty. Despite the limited information available, the family's centrality to the regime's narrative of continuity and legitimacy is undeniable. Part 13. The future of Kim Jong-un and North Korea. The future of Kim Jong-un's regime and North Korea is uncertain, shaped by a complex interplay of internal dynamics, international relations, and the country's unique socio-political structure. Predicting the fate of the regime is inherently speculative, but several plausible scenarios can be outlined based on historical patterns, current trends, and the challenges faced by North Korea. Scenario 1. Continued Kim family rule. The most likely scenario in the near term is the continuation of Kim Jong-un's leadership and the survival of the Kim dynasty. The regime has demonstrated remarkable resilience over the decades, successfully navigating challenges that could have destabilized less cohesive authoritarian systems. Several factors support the longevity of Kim's rule. Institutional control. The regime's control over the military, security apparatus, and ideological institutions ensures that dissent is swiftly suppressed. The pervasive surveillance state and harsh penalties for disloyalty deter potential opposition. Propaganda and loyalty. The cult of personality surrounding Kim Jong-un, combined with the deep-rooted indoctrination of the population, reinforces loyalty. Many North Koreans view the Kim family as synonymous with national identity. Nuclear deterrence. The development of nuclear weapons has bolstered the regime's security, deterring external intervention and providing leverage in international negotiations. Strategic adaptation. Kim Jong-un has shown an ability to adapt to changing circumstances, engaging in diplomacy when necessary and tightening control during crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. While internal dissent or external pressures could challenge the regime, the combination of repression, indoctrination, and strategic isolation makes it unlikely that the Kim family will lose control in the immediate future. Scenario 2. Gradual reform and opening. Another possible outcome is a gradual shift toward reform and limited opening to the outside world. This scenario would involve economic and social changes under Kim Jong-un's leadership or that of a future successor. Signs of this have been seen in the modest economic reforms introduced during Kim's tenure, such as granting greater autonomy to state-run enterprises and encouraging limited market activities. Key factors that could drive reform include economic necessity. The country's dire economic situation, exacerbated by international sanctions and isolation, may force the regime to adopt more significant reforms to ensure its survival. International engagement. Diplomatic overtures, such as the summits with South Korea and the United States, demonstrate that Kim is willing to engage with the outside world when it serves his interests. Generational change. Younger leaders within the regime may push for modernization to address the demands of a population increasingly exposed to outside information through smuggling and technology. However, reform is fraught with risks for the regime. Opening the country to foreign influence could undermine the regime's ideological control and expose the population to narratives that challenge the Kim family's legitimacy. Scenario 3. Internal collapse. A less likely but possible scenario is the collapse of the Kim regime due to internal factors. This could result from a combination of economic failure, political dissent, and loss of control over the military or security apparatus. Potential triggers for collapse include economic breakdown, prolonged sanctions, poor agricultural output, and a lack of foreign aid could lead to widespread famine or unrest, weakening the regime's grip on power. Elite defection, factionalism or dissatisfaction among the ruling elite, particularly within the military, could lead to a power struggle. The execution of figures like Jang Song-theek indicates that loyalty within the regime is not absolute. Popular uprising. While unlikely due to the regime's control over the population, a large-scale uprising could occur if economic conditions deteriorate to the point of desperation. In the event of a collapse, North Korea would face a chaotic transition, potentially involving civil conflict, military intervention by external powers, or even reunification with South Korea under highly uncertain conditions. Scenario 4. External conflict and regime change. A fourth scenario involves external intervention leading to the overthrow of the Kim regime. This could occur through military conflict or international efforts to destabilize the regime. While unlikely in the current geopolitical environment, tensions surrounding North Korea's nuclear program and provocations could escalate into armed conflict. Potential pathways to regime change include U.S. or allied military action. If North Korea were to launch an attack or threaten its neighbors, the United States and South Korea could respond with overwhelming force. Such an action would likely result in the regime's fall but would come at enormous human and economic costs. Chinese influence. China, concerned about instability on its border, could play a decisive role in shaping North Korea's future. If Beijing determined that the Kim regime was a liability, it might support a controlled transition to a more compliant government. The risks of external conflict make this scenario highly undesirable for all parties involved. The humanitarian and geopolitical consequences would be devastating, potentially leading to a prolonged crisis in the region. Conclusion. The Kim regime's resilience and fragility. The future of Kim Jong-un and North Korea is shaped by the tension between resilience and fragility. On one hand, the regime's control over its population, its nuclear deterrent, and its strategic adaptability make it likely to endure in the short to medium term. On the other hand, the country's economic vulnerabilities, dependence on external support, and potential internal dissent create long-term risks. Most likely outcome. the continuation of Kim Jong-un's rule, marked by a combination of repression, strategic diplomacy, and modest economic reforms. Potential for change, gradual reform or a managed transition is possible, though contingent on internal pressures and international engagement. Unlikely but possible scenarios: collapse or external regime change remain low probability events, but could occur under extreme conditions. Ultimately, the fate of North Korea and the Kim regime will depend on its ability to adapt to both internal and external challenges while maintaining its hold over a population shaped by decades of ideological indoctrination and isolation. Whether this adaptability leads to survival or transformation remains an open question.